The Bifrost did not fail so much as it forgot how to hold together. In the days after Ragnarok's ashes had settled over the 9 realms, the old roads between worlds had grown thin and unreliable, scarred by the deaths of gods who had once maintained them. It was through one such scar, invisible to any eye that was not divine, that Kratos fell. There was no light this time, no rainbow bridge of legend. Only a tearing, a cold that reached past flesh into whatever remained of a soul, and then grass. Wet grass, and the smell of pine and riverstone, utterly unlike the fjords of Midgard or the ash fields of his old home. He came down hard on one knee in a forest clearing lit by a moon he did not recognize, the Leviathan axe biting into the earth beside him, the blades of chaos coiled cold and silent at his hips. He did not call out. He had learned, across 2 pantheons and more deaths than he could count, that arrival in a strange place was rarely a moment for questions. It was a moment for stillness, for listening. The forest answered him with sound he did not expect. Not birdsong, not wind voices. Guttural, snarling things, moving in a pack through the underbrush perhaps 30 yards distant, and beneath their voices, a smell he knew intimately, blood, old and fresh both, and the particular reek of creatures that killed for pleasure as much as hunger. He rose. The Leviathan axe came free of the earth with a groan of frost, and he moved toward the sound rather than away from it, because in every world he had known, safety was a lie told to those too weak to make their own. What he found in a hollow beneath twisted black trees was not the wolves or Draugr he half expected. They were smaller than trolls, larger than men, hunched and yellow-eyed, wearing crude armor stitched from hide and scavenged iron, and they had encircled someone, pinned against a fallen log. A traveler in worn leather, hood thrown back in the struggle, a long knife in hand but outnumbered 8 to 1. Kratos did not weigh the odds of the stranger. He weighed only the creatures and found them wanting. The first orc never saw the axe that opened its skull to the collarbone. The frost of the Leviathan's edge froze the wound even as it killed, and the creature's death shriek was cut short by the ice climbing its throat. The second and third came at him together, crude blades raised, and Kratos caught one strike on his bracer, let the axe fly from his hand in a long arc that took the thrower's arm at the elbow before returning to his grip like an obedient hound. The remaining creatures, orcs, though Kratos had no name for them yet, broke formation, some fleeing, most attacking in the disorganized frenzy of animals that had never faced something that did not fear them. It was over in under a minute. Kratos stood amid the wreckage of 8 bodies, breathing steady, the blades of chaos still sheathed. He had not needed them. The stranger he had saved remained pressed against the log, knife still raised, watching him with an expression Kratos recognized from 1,000 years of being looked at by mortals. Not gratitude. Calculation. "You're not one of them," the man said. His voice carried an accent unlike any Kratos had heard, ancient and careful, like a language that had been spoken the same way for centuries. "And you're no ranger I know." Kratos said nothing. He studied the man in turn, tall, weathered, a face that had seen more roads than years, a star-shaped brooch at his throat and a sword whose make Kratos didn't recognize but whose balance he respected on sight. Not a soldier. Something older. A hunter of a different kind. "Where I have come from does not matter," Kratos finally said, his voice a low rasp that seemed to still the very air of the clearing. "These creatures, what are they?" The man's eyes narrowed, though whether from suspicion or simple confusion at the question, Kratos could not tell. "Orcs? Servants of the enemy or what's left of him? You've never seen an orc before?" "No." "Then where?" The man stopped himself, sheathing his knife slowly though he did not relax. "Forgive me. It has been a long few weeks on strange roads, and stranger company grows less surprising by the day. I am called Strider by some." He did not offer more and Kratos did not ask for it. Names, in his experience, were currency spent carefully among strangers. Kratos looked down at the axe in his hand, its frost already receding back into the metal, and then at the dead things scattered around them, creatures that bled black and stank of corruption in a way that reminded him, distantly and unwelcome, of Hell's own creations. This was not Midgard. This was not any realm the Norse gods had shaped, nor any place Greece's old pantheon had touched. The stars above, when he glanced up through the canopy, were wrong, familiar in their brightness but arranged in patterns his memory could not place. "This world," Kratos said. "Its name." Strider's brow furrowed, the question clearly stranger to him than the fight had been. "Middle-earth. You stand in Eriador, west of the misty mountains, east of the sea." He studied Kratos with new intensity now, taking in the pale ash marks across weathered skin, the axe that seemed to breathe cold, the sheer wrongness of a man who did not know the name of the world he stood in. You are no ordinary traveler. Where do you hail from that you don't know an orc from a shadow, yet fight like you've done it since before these hills had names? I have killed things that called themselves gods, Kratos said, and it was not a boast, it was simply wearily true. Twice over. I do not know your enemy. I do not know your orcs. I know only that they meant to kill you, and that I do not care for creatures that hunt in packs against the outnumbered. Something shifted in Strider's expression. Not trust, not yet, but a kind of recalculation, the look of a man revising a map in his head. There are names for things like you in old stories, he said quietly, almost to himself. Beings out of the world's earliest ages walking still. I did not think I would meet one on the road to Bree. I am not from your stories, Kratos said. I do not know how I came to be here or how I will leave. Until I understand this place, I intend to remain apart from it. It was, even as he said it, a lie he wanted badly to be true. He had said such things before. In Greece, after the deaths of his family, after Ares, after the long climb up Olympus that had left him godless and alone atop a mountain of corpses that included his own daughter's blood on his hands, metaphorically if not literally. He had said it again in the frozen north, arriving in Midgard wanting nothing but silence, wanting to raise a son far from the wars of gods, and war had found him there too, dragged him back into it by the throat, ended with Asgard burning and Odin's ravens scattered to the wind. Every world he touched seemed to demand blood of him eventually. He had learned, bitterly, not to promise himself otherwise. But he said the words anyway because some part of him, small, stubborn, the part that still remembered a boy's hand in his, wanted this time to be different. Strider did not press him further, which Kratos respected. Instead the ranger crouched by one of the fallen orcs, examining its crude armor with the eye of a man reading a message written in a familiar hand. These bear the marks of Isengard, he murmured, not Mordor. That is troubling. Saruman's creatures do not usually range this far west. He glanced up. You said you don't know where you are. Do you know when? What year, what age? No. Then you have a great deal to learn and quickly if you mean to survive here. Strider rose, sheathing his sword fully now. The world is moving toward war, stranger. A war older and larger than any orc raid in a forest. If you are truly apart from all of this, I would counsel you to find shelter and wait it out. But something tells me a man who fights the way you fight will not be given that choice for long. Kratos said nothing to this because he suspected, with the particular weary certainty of a being who had lived this exact conversation in 2 other lifetimes, 2 other worlds, that the ranger was right. Wars had a way of finding him even when he turned his back on them. Perhaps it was the nature of what he was. Perhaps the gods, wherever they had gone, still owed him this one cruelty, that peace would never be permitted to a man who had killed so many of them. The forest around them was quiet now, the last of the fleeing orcs long gone into the dark, and somewhere far off, faint on the wind, came the first suggestion of hoofbeats. More travelers or more danger, Kratos could not yet tell. He hefted the Leviathan axe, feeling its familiar weight settle against his palm like the only constant he had left, and looked to Strider. I did not ask for your war, Kratos said. I will not promise you my sword in it. But I will not stand by while creatures like these hunt the outnumbered. That much at least I owe to no god but myself. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy. Wait, wrong universe, but if you want to see more legendary characters collide with worlds far from their own, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see next in the comments below. Strider allowed himself something close to a smile, small and tired. Then let us hope, stranger, that is enough. Come, there is a fire not far from here and questions enough between us to fill the night. Kratos followed him into the dark, the ash of 2 dead pantheons still clinging to his skin, walking once more toward a war he had not chosen and could not yet name. The fire Strider led him to was smaller than Kratos expected, tucked into a hollow between 2 leaning boulders where the light would not carry far. 3 others sat around it, and all 3 came to their feet the moment Kratos stepped into the clearing, hands going to blades and bows with the swiftness of people who had survived by never being caught unprepared. Peace, Strider said, raising a hand. He fought at my side against a pack of Isengard's orcs not an hour past. Whatever else he is not our enemy tonight. The wariness did not leave their eyes, but the weapons lowered, fractionally. Kratos studied them in turn, the way he studied any unfamiliar terrain, for threat, for weakness, for the shape of the days ahead. 2 were clearly of the same blood as Strider, rangers by the plain, practical cut of their gear, though younger, quieter. The 3rd was different entirely, shorter than the rest, barrel-chested, a great braided beard the color of iron, and an axe of his own resting across his knees that he had not fully released even as the others stood down. "A dwarf," Strider said, following Kratos's gaze, "and two of my kinsmen. We're bound for Bree and beyond it, further business that is not easily explained around a campfire to a stranger who does not know what year it is." The dwarf snorted, a sound that carried equal parts amusement and suspicion. "Doesn't know what year it is. Doesn't know an orc from his own shadow, you said?" His eyes, sharp beneath heavy brows, raked over Kratos's frame, the ash-pale skin, the crimson markings, the axe that seemed to hum faintly even at rest. "And carries a weapon I've never seen forged in any hall I know. Where do you hail from, stranger, that even a dwarf can't place your steel?" "A place far from here," Kratos said. It was the only honest answer he had, and he had learned long ago that vague honesty served him better than convenient lies. "I do not know how I came to be in your world. I do not know your wars, your kings, or your enemies. I know only what I have seen tonight, orcs hunting men in the dark and a fight I chose to finish. Middle-earth has room enough for strange travelers," Strider said, settling by the fire. "But I'll ask you plainly, since plain seems to suit you, what are you if not a man?" Kratos considered the question longer than the others expected. In another life, in another world, he might have answered with violence, or with silence stretched into a threat. But something about the honesty of the question, asked without fear, only curiosity, loosened something old in his chest. "I was born a mortal," he said. "A Spartan in a land you have never heard of and never will, across a distance no ship of yours could cross. I became something else through blood and rage and the deaths of beings who called themselves gods. I have carried that weight through two collapsed pantheons. I do not know what your world would call me. I no longer know what to call myself." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Even the dwarf's grip on his axe eased, though his eyes remained fixed on Kratos with an intensity that suggested he was reassessing every assumption he'd made in the last minute. "Gods?" the dwarf finally said. "You speak of killing gods the way I'd speak of killing goblins. That's either the boast of a madman or the confession of something Middle-earth has no ready name for." "I am not given to boasting," Kratos said simply, and something in his flat, weary tone must have carried more conviction than any oath could have, because the dwarf's expression shifted from suspicion to something closer to unease. One of the younger rangers, a woman with dark hair pulled back tight and eyes that missed nothing, finally spoke. "If you truly don't know this world, then you don't know what's coming. The enemy stirs in the east. Sauron has returned to Mordor in strength, and his shadow lengthens over everything. Gondor, Rohan, the free peoples of the west, all of it. What you fought tonight was not some wandering band. Isengard's orcs mean Saruman has broken faith with the White Council, which means the war we feared is closer than any of us wished to believe." Kratos absorbed this the way he absorbed all unfamiliar information now, filing it away, weighing its shape against what little he understood of this world's structure. Gods or an enemy that functioned as one. A shadow spreading from the east. Free peoples arrayed against it. It was not so different in its bones from wars he had already fought and buried. Olympus against mortals who dared defy it, Asgard's long descent into Ragnarok. He had thought, foolishly, that he had left such patterns behind him. Apparently the universe, or whatever passed for one here, disagreed. "Your enemy," Kratos said. "Sauron. Is he a god as your people understand it?" Strider's expression grew careful, weighing how much to share with a man who claimed no allegiance and no history in this world. "Not a god as the old tales of the East once spoke of them. He is a spirit, ancient, powerful beyond most reckoning, bound once to physical form and broken from it, working now through servants, through fear, through a single object of terrible craft that all his strength was poured into an age ago." He paused. "A ring. The one ring, forged to rule all others, lost for centuries and now found again, found and in motion, toward a reckoning none of us can yet see the end of." There was a weight in how the ranger spoke of it, a careful reverence that told Kratos this was no small matter, no simple relic. He had felt that same weight before, standing before Pandora's box, before the corpses of gods whose power still clung to their remains like poison in the air. Objects that could reshape the fate of worlds were never spoken of lightly by those who understood them. "And this ring," Kratos said. "It is near." The silence that answered him was confirmation enough. Strider's jaw tightened, and the dwarf shifted uncomfortably, and the two younger rangers exchanged a glance that spoke of secrets they were not yet permitted to share with a stranger fresh out of a rift in the sky. "That," Strider said carefully, "is not a matter for tonight's fire. Suffice to say that greater and wiser than us are already carrying that burden toward its reckoning, and our task is smaller, to see certain travelers safely to Rivendell, where counsel wiser than mine will decide what is to be done. He studied Kratos across the flames. You said you wish to remain apart from this world's wars. I will not press you to abandon that wish. But Rivendell is the safest place I know of in these lands for one such as you. Answers may be found there that even I cannot give. Elrond has counseled kings and fought in wars before the sun you're used to ever rose over these hills, if you take my meaning. Kratos turned the offer over. Every instinct honed by centuries of betrayal told him to refuse, to vanish into the wilderness and find his own path, trust no counsel but his own. That instinct had kept him alive through the deaths of two pantheons. But he was also, for the first time since the rift had thrown him into this cold forest, entirely without direction. No home to return to, no enemy to hunt, no sun waiting for him at a fire of his own making. The absence of purpose sat in his chest like a stone, and against his better judgment, he found the offer of answers even from strangers, difficult to dismiss entirely. I will travel with you as far as this Rivendell, Kratos said finally. Not as an ally in your war. As a man seeking to understand where he has fallen, and how he might yet leave it. He fixed Strider with a look that carried its own quiet warning. Do not mistake my company for loyalty. I have sworn oaths before. I do not make them lightly, and I will not make one to a war that is not mine. Understood, Strider said, and something in his weathered face suggested he had expected nothing less. Get what rest you can, stranger. Dawn comes early and Bree is still 2 days distant, with roads that grow less friendly by the season. The dwarf grunted something that might have been agreement, settling back against his pack, though his eyes lingered on Kratos a while longer before finally closing. The two rangers took up positions at the clearing's edge, watching the dark with the ease of long practice. Kratos did not sleep. He rarely did, not truly, not since the visions of his dead family had first begun haunting the spaces behind his eyes, but he sat near the fire with the Leviathan axe across his knees, watching the strange stars wheel overhead through gaps in the canopy, and thought of how many times he had told himself a war was not his, only to find his hands soaked in its blood before the telling was through. Somewhere to the east, beyond mountains he could not yet see, something ancient and patient had already begun to sense that a new and unclassifiable power had entered its world. It would take time for that awareness to sharpen into interest, and longer still for interest to become intent. But in the black tower that watched all things, something had shifted in the pattern of the world's threats. A piece on the board that did not match any shape it had accounted for. The fire burned low, and Kratos kept his silent watch, unaware that far away, a single unblinking eye had already begun faintly to search. The road to Bree cut through country that grew wilder and more watchful with every mile, and it was on the second day of travel that Kratos began to understand the weight the man called Strider carried beneath his plain traveling cloak. It happened at a river crossing, where the water ran high and cold from mountain snowmelt and the ford was treacherous with hidden stones. The dwarf, who had introduced himself grudgingly the night before as Gimlin, of no house Kratos recognized, though the name was offered with a wariness that suggested pride wounded by circumstance, slipped on the crossing and was swept a dozen yards downstream before Kratos caught him by the collar of his mail and hauled him bodily onto the far bank as though the dwarf weighed nothing at all. Gimlin coughed river water and glared up at him with a mixture of gratitude and indignation that seemed to be his natural resting state. I had it under control. You did not, Kratos said, and there was no cruelty in it, only fact. It was Strider's reaction that told Kratos something had shifted. The ranger had moved to help before Kratos acted, sword half drawn as though to fashion some tool from the blade to reach the dwarf, and had stopped, watching instead as Kratos closed the distance in 3 strides and hauled Gimlin free with strength that should have required a rope and a team of horses. There was calculation in the ranger's eyes now, the same careful reassessment Kratos had seen the first night, except sharper. You could have broken his spine, pulling him like that, Strider said once they made camp that evening, the words carrying less accusation than genuine curiosity. I did not, Kratos said. I know the strength I carry. I have carried worse weights than a dwarf out of worse rivers. That is precisely what concerns me. Strider settled across from him, the fire between them casting the ranger's weathered face in shifting light. I have led men through danger for the better part of my life, stranger. I know the shape of ordinary strength, and the shape of a blade swung by a soldier's training. What you carry is neither. It unsettles my companions, even those too proud to say so. He paused. It unsettles me. Kratos did not look away from the fire. You wish to know if I am a danger to you. I wish to know what you are, and whether Middle-earth is safer or poorer for your presence in it. Strider's voice was level, but there was steel beneath it now, the tone of a man who had made hard judgments before and did not shy from making another. I have seen what power without conscience does to this world. I have seen kings broken by rings of lesser make than the one, servants of the enemy who were men once, before ambition or fear or simple greed hollowed them into something else. You speak of killing gods as though it cost you nothing. I do not believe that is true. I think it cost you a great deal, and I think you are still paying that price in ways you have not shared with us. The words landed with more precision than Kratos expected, and for a long moment he said nothing, watching the flames instead of the man across them. He thought of Olympus, of the boy, his son, left behind on a mountain of ash. He thought of Faye, of the promise he had failed to keep, of Baldur's broken body and Odin's ravens and every death that had followed him from one world's ending into this one's uncertain beginning. Strider was not wrong. Nothing about killing gods had been free. I have lost everyone I ever tried to protect, Kratos said finally, the words coming slower than he intended, drawn out of him by something in the ranger's patient, unflinching attention. A wife. A daughter. A god I called son in the end, though I did not deserve to. Every power I have gained came paired with a grief I did not ask for and could not refuse. If you are asking whether I would use what I carry against your world without cause, the answer is no. I have buried too many for causes that were not mine to want another. He met Strider's eyes directly. But do not mistake restraint for harmlessness. If your world gives me cause, I will not hesitate. I have never hesitated. It is the one mercy and the one curse I have never lost. Something passed across Strider's face, not fear but a kind of grim recognition, as though he had heard an echo of something he understood in his own bones. There is a burden I carry too, the ranger said, quiet enough that the words seemed meant only for the fire between them. One I have not shared with you and will not tonight. But know this, I do not judge men by the power they hold. I judge them by what they choose to do with it, especially when no one is watching to hold them accountable. You had no reason to save Gimlin from that river beyond the fact that he would have drowned. That tells me more than any oath you could swear. Gimlin, feigning sleep a few feet away, cracked one eye open at the mention of his name but said nothing, listening with the particular attentiveness of someone who wanted very much to seem uninterested. Your ring, Kratos said, changing the current of the conversation deliberately. The one your companions guard so carefully in their silences. I have felt something like it before, an object that does not merely hold power but hungers for it, that reshapes the will of those near it. He thought of Pandora's box, of the way its promise of hope had nearly consumed everyone who touched it, himself included. Is that its nature? Strider's expression grew guarded again, the openness of a moment before folding back into caution. You are perceptive for a man who claims no knowledge of this world. I have handled cursed things before. I know their weight even when I cannot name them. Kratos held the ranger's gaze. I do not ask to see it or to touch it. I ask only because I mean to understand the danger I am walking beside, if I am to travel further into your world's troubles. For a long moment, Strider seemed to weigh how much truth the stranger had earned. Finally, he exhaled, the sound carrying the weariness of a man who had been guarding this secret for far longer than the few days Kratos had known him. The ring you sense is not carried by me, nor by anyone in this company. It travels ahead of us in hands smaller and, I hope, purer than mine, entrusted to one who did not ask for the burden and bears it with more courage than most grown warriors I have known. We are bound for Bree to meet him, and then onward to Rivendell, where the fate of that ring will be decided by wiser counsel than a ranger's sword can offer. He fixed Kratos with a look that held both warning and something almost like plea. I tell you this because you have proven twice now that you do not act from malice. But I ask you not to seek the ring out, not to touch it, not to let curiosity draw you near it. It corrupts. It has broken stronger wills than either of ours, and I have watched what it did to a man I called friend, long before you fell into these woods. Kratos considered this, turning the warning over with the same care he gave any threat assessment. He thought of the way power had corrupted Olympus from within, the way Zeus's fear of prophecy had poisoned an entire pantheon long before Kratos had ever raised a blade against it. He thought of Odin, wisdom curdled into paranoia and cruelty across centuries of hoarded power. He understood, perhaps better than Strider realized, exactly what kind of corruption the ranger was describing. I have no interest in rings, Kratos said. I have carried enough cursed weight of my own. I will not add to it by choice. Something in Strider's shoulders eased, fractionally. Then we understand each other. He rose, drawing his cloak tighter against the night's growing chill. Bree lies a half-day's walk from here. We will reach it by midday tomorrow, and there you will meet the one whose burden I have described. though I would ask you to guard your tongue about gods and pantheons in his presence, at least until we are safely away from prying ears. Bree is a crossroads town, and crossroads towns have a way of carrying secrets to the wrong ones. Kratos nodded once, and Strider moved off to relieve one of the younger rangers at watch, leaving Kratos alone by the dying fire with Gimlin's feigned snoring for company and the strange star-wrung sky wheeling slowly overhead. He thought, as he often did in the quiet hours when sleep would not come, of how easily trust had been extended to him here, not blindly, not foolishly, but carefully, incrementally, the way a wary soldier tests a bridge before committing his full weight to it. Strider had judged him not by the axe in his hand or the power he could sense radiating from him, but by the choices Kratos made when no test was being administered. It was, Kratos realized with something like surprise, the first time in either of his two collapsed lives that judgment had been offered to him on those terms rather than assumed based on fear or reputation. He did not know yet whether that judgment would hold once this world's true dangers revealed themselves. He did not know whether the man called Strider carried burdens heavy enough to eventually demand something of Kratos that he was unwilling to give. But for the first time since the rift had thrown him into this cold, wrong-starred forest, Kratos found himself curious, genuinely, cautiously curious, about what kind of world could produce a ranger willing to extend trust so carefully earned to a stranger who admitted, without shame, to killing gods. The fire burned down to embers, and somewhere far to the east, in a tower of black stone, the search that had begun as a faint disturbance in the pattern of the world sharpened, ever so slightly, into something closer to intent. Bree announced itself first by smell, wood smoke, roasting meat, unwashed animals and unwashed men, all tangled together in a way that struck Kratos as almost comfortingly mortal after days of forest silence. The town rose out of the hills like something grown rather than built, a jumble of low stone and timber houses ringed by an earthen dike and a wooden gate manned by a gatekeeper who eyed their company with the particular suspicion Bree folk reserved for strangers arriving after dark. "Rangers," the gatekeeper muttered, as though the word explained and excused everything, and waved them through with barely a second glance. His eyes lingered longer on Kratos, on the axe strapped across his back, the pale ash-marked skin, the sheer wrongness of him. But Strider said something low and reassuring, and the gate creaked open regardless. The prancing pony was louder than Kratos expected, firelight and pipe smoke and the low roar of conversation spilling out into the street even before they reached the door. Strider led them not to the common room but to a side passage, murmuring instructions to Gimlin and the two younger rangers to wait and watch before he gestured Kratos to follow him alone. "The one we're meeting travels under a different name here," Strider said quietly as they walked. "Caution in these times is not paranoia. I would ask the same discretion from you. No mention of gods, no mention of the world you fell from. Let them see a traveling companion, nothing more, until trust is better established." Kratos said nothing but inclined his head once. He understood the value of a mask. He had worn enough of them himself, across enough lifetimes, to respect another man's need for one. They found the meeting room at the passage's end, small, low-ceilinged, lit by a single lamp, and occupied by 4 figures who rose as the door opened, hands going instinctively to hidden blades before recognition eased their postures. 3 were small, no taller than Gimlin though built entirely differently, round-faced, bright-eyed, with curling hair and bare feet despite the autumn chill, creatures Kratos had no context for at all. The 4th was taller, cloaked in gray, leaning on a wooden staff carved with symbols that made something in the air around him hum faintly, in a register Kratos' senses recognized instinctively as power, old and vast and carefully restrained. "Strider," the gray-cloaked figure said, his voice carrying easily despite its quiet register, "you bring an unexpected guest. Gandalf." Strider inclined his head with clear respect. "This is a complicated tale, and I would rather tell it plainly than let rumor shape it first. This man fought at my side against a band of Isengard's orcs 3 nights past in the Trollshaws, where by his own account he had only just arrived, fallen, he says, from a tear in the sky itself, out of a world none of us have ever heard of." The gray-cloaked figure, Gandalf, turned his full attention on Kratos, and it was unlike any scrutiny Kratos had endured since arriving in this world. There was no fear in it and no simple suspicion either. It was the look of something ancient measuring something else ancient, searching for the shape and weight of a power it did not immediately recognize. "A tear in the sky," Gandalf repeated slowly. "That is no small claim and no small occurrence if true. The roads between worlds are not so easily broken, even in an age as troubled as this one." He studied Kratos a moment longer, and something shifted in his weathered face, not alarm but a kind of careful, deepening interest. "You carry something old, stranger." Older than anything native to these lands, I think, though I confess I cannot yet place its nature. Divine, and yet, not of the Vala, not of any power I recognize from the tales of this world's shaping. I am not of your world's shaping, Kratos said. I have told the ranger as much. I killed gods in the place I came from, twice across 2 dead pantheons. I do not know what tore me from that place and dropped me into yours. I know only that I did not ask for it, and I do not yet know how to undo it. One of the small round-faced creatures, hobbits, Kratos would later learn they were called, made a small, startled sound, and the others exchanged glances that mixed fear and fascination in roughly equal measure. Gandalf, though, only nodded slowly as though Kratos's words confirmed rather than alarmed him. There are old tales, the wizard said, older than even the elves remember clearly, of powers beyond the circles of this world, beings who shaped other realities entirely with their own gods, their own wars, their own endings. If even a fraction of such tales hold truth, then a being such as you, cast loose from a broken world into an unbroken one, is not impossible. Troubling certainly, but not impossible. He leaned slightly on his staff, studying Kratos with renewed intensity. Tell me, stranger, do you know how the gods of your world died? By my hand, Kratos said without embellishment or shame. Every one of them who stood in the way of the peace I tried and failed to build. I do not offer that as a boast. It is simply what happened and what I have carried since. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. One of the hobbits, younger than the others with wide, guileless eyes, stared at Kratos with an expression that mingled horror and something almost like awe. Gandalf, though, only closed his eyes briefly, as though weighing some private calculation, before opening them again with an expression that had settled into careful, measured resolve. I will not pretend your presence does not concern me, the wizard said. A being who has killed gods, arrived in a world that has its own ancient and terrible power moving toward war, is not a small matter to absorb over a single night's introduction. But I have lived long enough and seen enough strange workings of fate, to know that not every unexpected arrival is a doom. Sometimes it is simply an accident, tragic, disorienting, but without larger design behind it. He tilted his head slightly. Which do you believe yours to be, stranger? Accident or design? It was a question Kratos had turned over himself, alone in the dark hours of the past several nights, without arriving at an answer he trusted. I do not know, he admitted. I have been the instrument of other beings' designs before, without my knowledge or consent, until the design revealed itself too late to refuse. I would rather assume accident and be wrong than assume design and be paralyzed by the assuming. A pragmatic philosophy, Gandalf said, and something like the ghost of approval touched his weathered features. One I find myself sympathetic to in these times. He turned to Strider. You vouch for him? I have watched him fight, and I have watched him choose restraint when restraint cost him nothing to abandon, Strider said. That is not the same as trust freely given. But it is enough, I think, to grant him what caution allows. Gandalf considered this for a long moment, his gaze drifting once more to Kratos, taking in the full measure of him. The axe, the scars, the weariness that Kratos suspected showed more plainly on his face than he intended. Very well, the wizard said finally. I will not turn away a stranger who fights beside my friends and asks no reward for it beyond understanding. But I will say this plainly, stranger, so there is no misunderstanding between us. This world stands at the edge of a war larger and older than any single battle. There is a ring in this room's company that must not fall into the wrong hands, and a burden being carried by one far too young and untested for the weight of it. If your presence here proves a danger to that burden, by design, by accident, or by simple carelessness, I will not hesitate to act against you whatever power you carry. Do we understand each other? There was no threat in the words, only plain, weighted honesty, the same honesty Kratos had offered Strider 3 nights before, and he found himself respecting the wizard more for the directness than he would have respected easy reassurance. We understand each other, Kratos said. I have no interest in your ring. I have carried cursed weight of my own, and I do not covet more. Then let us hope that remains true, Gandalf said, for both our sakes. He turned to the smallest of the hobbits, the wide-eyed one who had stared at Kratos throughout the exchange with an expression caught between terror and fascination. Frodo. This is the stranger Strider spoke of. I would ask that you treat him with the same caution you would any newly met traveler, no more, no less, until time proves what manner of ally or simple bystander he intends to be. Frodo. The name meant nothing to Kratos yet, but something in the way the others in the room, Strider, Gandalf, even the other 2 hobbits, positioned themselves subtly around the small, wide-eyed figure told Kratos everything he needed to understand about the boy's importance, even without being told outright. This was the bearer. The one carrying the cursed thing Strider had warned him against seeking. Kratos inclined his head toward the hobbit, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than deference. "I mean you no harm," he said simply. "I have said the same to your companions, and I will say it as many times as needed until my actions prove it truer than my words." Frodo swallowed visibly, but managed a small nod in return, and something in the careful courage of that small gesture, a mortal, clearly frightened, choosing not to flinch away entirely, struck a chord in Kratos that he did not examine too closely. He had seen courage like that before, in smaller and stranger forms, in a boy who had once looked up at him across a burning world and chosen not to look away. Gandalf watched the exchange with quiet, careful attention, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a decision already forming. "We ride for Rivendell within the week," the wizard said. "The roads grow more dangerous by the day, and I sense the enemy's attention sharpening toward this company faster than I would like. If you mean to travel with us that far, stranger, I would have you do so under my watch, not merely the Rangers. I have questions about the nature of your arrival that I suspect neither of us can yet answer, and Rivendell holds counsel wiser than mine to help untangle them." "I will travel with you," Kratos said, "as far as your Rivendell, and no further oath than that." Gandalf's mouth curved, the barest suggestion of dry humor beneath the weight of the moment. "No further oath than that is precisely the kind of honesty this company could use more of these days." He straightened, leaning once more on his staff, the momentary softness in his expression hardening back into purpose. "Rest while you can, all of you. The road from here grows harder before it grows easier, and I fear we have not yet seen the worst of what watches us from the shadows." Outside the small room's single narrow window, breeze noise continued unabated. Laughter, music, the ordinary clamor of mortal lives lived in blissful ignorance of the war gathering at the world's edges. Kratos stood near that window a while after the others had begun settling for what rest the night allowed, watching the town's lights flicker against the dark, and thought of how many times he had stood at the edge of an ordinary world about to be consumed by a war it did not yet know was coming. He did not know yet what role he was meant to play in this one, if any. But for the first time since the rift had thrown him into this strange, star-wrung world, he found himself less concerned with escaping it, and more curious about the small, frightened, unshakably brave hobbit whose courage had reminded him, however briefly, of a son he had failed to save. The road to Rivendell took the better part of a week, and it was not gentle. Twice more they were tracked, once by wolves that moved with an unnatural coordination Gandalf named wargs, servants bred and directed rather than simply wild, and once by something Kratos never saw clearly, only felt. A cold that had nothing to do with weather, pressing at the edges of the company's camp for the better part of a night before withdrawing without explanation. Gandalf's face had gone tight and grim after that second encounter, and he had said little the following day, riding ahead of the group with his staff held ready in a way that told Kratos the danger had been real, whatever its shape. It was Frodo who unsettled Kratos more than either threat, in the end, not through any fault of the hobbits, but through the way his condition seemed to worsen incrementally as the days passed, a wound at his shoulder that would not fully heal, a paleness creeping into his face that spoke of something deeper than ordinary injury. Kratos had seen wounds like it before, in men marked by curses rather than blades, and he recognized the particular exhaustion in Gandalf's eyes each time the wizard checked on the hobbit as the exhaustion of someone racing a clock only he could see. They reached Rivendell on a morning when the mist still clung low in the valley, and the sight of it, white towers rising from a fold of the hills, waterfalls threading silver between them, the whole valley humming with a kind of ambient, watchful peace, struck Kratos with an unexpected force. He had seen the halls of Olympus in their glory before he tore them down. He had seen Asgard's golden towers before Ragnarok reduced them to ash. There was something in Rivendell's beauty that reminded him uncomfortably of both, the particular fragile beauty of power that did not yet know it was doomed. Elrond received them not in a throne room but in an open hall overlooking the valley, seated among a handful of advisors and warriors whose bearing marked them immediately as old and formidable, whatever gentleness their surroundings suggested. He was tall, dark-haired, ageless in a way that unsettled Kratos more than he expected, not the frozen youth of divine vanity he had seen in lesser gods, but something deeper, an age worn without decay, wisdom accumulated rather than merely survived. "Gandalf," Elrond said, rising. "You bring urgent news, I think, even before you speak it. And company I was not told to expect." His gaze settled on Kratos, and there was none of the immediate suspicion Kratos had grown accustomed to, only a long, careful measuring attention that felt uncomfortably like being read down to the bone. A complicated matter, and one that must be discussed with the full council, I think, before Frodo's wound can be properly addressed, Gandalf said. But first, and here his voice dropped with clear urgency, the boy needs attention now, not after debate. The wound festers, and I fear it carries something beyond ordinary poison. Elrond's expression sharpened instantly, all measured calm giving way to swift decisiveness, and he called for aid before Gandalf had finished speaking, hobbits and rangers alike moving to carry Frodo toward the healing halls with an urgency that told Kratos plainly how serious the matter had become. Kratos watched the boy carried away, pale and shivering despite the warmth of the valley air, and felt something old and unwelcome stir in his chest. The particular helplessness of watching a child suffer a wound he could not fight on their behalf. It was hours later, after Frodo had been tended and word came that he would live, that Elrond turned his full attention back to the matter of Kratos. The council chamber where he was finally received was smaller than Kratos expected, populated by perhaps a dozen figures. Elrond at its head, Gandalf beside him, Strider present as well though seated with a deference Kratos hadn't seen him show elsewhere, and several others whose bearing marked them as representatives of peoples and places Kratos did not yet know. Elves with ancient, watchful eyes. A stern-faced dwarf lord who eyed Kratos' axe with obvious professional interest. A man in fine but travel-worn armor who carried himself with the particular tension of someone representing a kingdom under siege. "Tell us your account," Elrond said once the company had settled, "from the beginning. Leave nothing out, however strange it may seem to your ear. We have heard stranger things in this hall than a traveler from beyond the circles of the world, though I confess such a thing has not occurred in an age I can readily recall." Kratos told it plainly: the rift, the forest, the fight that had drawn Strider's notice, the pantheons he had buried, the family he had lost, the endless cycle of war that seemed to find him no matter how far he tried to walk from it. He did not embellish and he did not soften the darker portions. The deaths of his wife and daughter, the murder of his own father, the long bloody climb up a mountain that had ended with him standing alone atop the wreckage of everything he had once called divine. Some of the council's faces grew guarded as he spoke, others grew merely thoughtful, weighing his words with the careful neutrality of people trained to judge testimony for a living. When he finished, the silence in the chamber stretched long enough that Kratos began to recognize it, not as fear precisely, but as the particular caution of a room full of people who understood, better than most mortals could, exactly what kind of power had just been described to them. "You speak of killing gods as plainly as another man might speak of chopping wood," the dwarf lord finally said, gruff suspicion coloring every word. "Forgive me if that troubles me more than it seems to trouble you." "It troubled me a great deal when it happened," Kratos said. "It troubles me still in the quiet hours. I have simply had a long time to grow accustomed to carrying that weight without letting it show on my face. That is not the same as it costing nothing." Elrond studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "There is a question this council must answer, stranger, and it is not merely whether you speak truth. I believe you do, unusual as your account is. The question is whether a being capable of what you describe is safe to have within these lands, whatever your intentions. Power such as yours does not need malice to cause harm. It requires only proximity to matters delicate enough that even well-meant strength can shatter what careful diplomacy has built." "That is a fair concern," Kratos said, "and I will not pretend otherwise. I have shattered things I meant to protect before, through strength applied without enough caution. I have learned at great cost to weigh that risk before I act. But I did not come to your world seeking power or purpose. I came because a rift threw me here against my will, and I remain because I have not yet found a way home. If your council decides I am a danger that must be contained or removed, I will not raise a hand against that judgment, provided it is offered honestly rather than out of simple fear." This seemed to catch several of the council members off guard. Clearly they had expected either denial or threat, not the calm offer of submission to their judgment. Gandalf, who had remained quiet through most of the exchange, finally spoke. "I have watched this man for the better part of a week," the wizard said. "He has fought beside us without demanding reward. He refused an opportunity to press Frodo for details about the ring, even when curiosity would have been forgivable. He carried a dwarf from a river without a thought for his own safety in doing so. I do not offer blind trust, I have lived too long for that, but I offer this: whatever darkness lives in his past, I have seen no evidence of it directing his choices here." The man in travel-worn armor, who had been introduced earlier as Boromir of Gondor, leaned forward with an expression that mixed calculation and something closer to hunger than Kratos entirely liked. "If what he says is true, If he has truly killed gods, faced armies no mortal force could withstand, then perhaps this council is asking the wrong question. Perhaps instead of debating whether to trust him, we should be asking whether Gondor, whether all the free peoples facing Sauron's growing strength, can afford to turn away a weapon such as this. He is not a weapon to be pointed at your enemies, Boromir, Elrond said, a note of warning entering his voice. He is a person with his own will and his own grief, however unusual its origin. I would remind this council that treating power as a tool to be claimed rather than a will to be respected is precisely the temptation that has doomed better men than any gathered here. Kratos said nothing through this exchange, though something in Boromir's hungry calculation set old, familiar alarm bells ringing in the back of his mind. He had seen that exact look before, on the faces of kings and generals who valued him only for what violence he could commit on their behalf. It was, perhaps, the first genuinely unpleasant sensation he had experienced in this world. The reminder that even careful trust could curdle, given the right pressure, into something closer to exploitation. I will say this plainly so there is no confusion among you, Kratos said, his voice carrying enough weight that the chamber's murmur of debate quieted immediately. I am not a sword to be pointed. I fought beside your ranger because innocents were being hunted, and I do not stand idle while that happens in front of me. I will not swear my strength to your war simply because it is convenient for your purposes. If I choose to fight in this conflict, it will be because I have judged the cause worth the cost on my own terms, not because your council has decided I am useful. The silence that followed carried a different texture than before, not suspicion exactly, but the recalibration of people confronting a will as immovable as the power it commanded. Elrond, watching Kratos with new and careful attention, finally spoke. That, the Elf Lord said slowly, is precisely the answer I needed to hear, though perhaps not the one my kinsman Boromir hoped for. He rose from his seat, addressing the full council now rather than Kratos alone. This stranger will be granted the hospitality of Rivendell while this matter is further considered, and while the larger question before this council, the fate of the ring itself, is decided in the days ahead. I would ask that no member of this council attempt to press him toward allegiance he has not freely offered, and that no member treat his presence as either guaranteed ally or confirmed threat until his own choices reveal which he intends to be. The council began to disperse, murmured conversations trailing after them into the valley's soft afternoon light, but Kratos remained a moment longer, meeting Elrond's steady gaze across the emptying chamber. You did not answer the question my kinsman raised, Elrond said quietly, once most of the others had gone. Whether this war can afford to turn away power such as yours. No, Kratos agreed. I did not because I do not yet know the answer myself. I have fought wars I believed were mine to fight, and watched them cost me everything I loved. I am no longer eager to make that mistake a third time without cause I trust completely. He held the Elf Lord's gaze. But I will say this, your ring troubles me more than your council seems to realize. I have felt cursed things before. I have watched what they do to the willing and unwilling alike. If that ring is truly what your people fear it to be, I do not think this council has the luxury of deciding my usefulness at leisure. I think you are running out of time faster than your careful debates account for. Elrond's expression did not change, but something in his eyes suggested the words had landed exactly as intended, not as threat, but as warning, offered by someone who understood from bitter experience, precisely how quickly careful deliberation could be overtaken by disaster. That, the Elf Lord said finally, is a fear this council shares, stranger, whatever our disagreements about your place within it. He turned to look out over the valley, its waterfalls catching the afternoon light in threads of silver and gold. We will meet again formally before the week is done, to decide the ring's fate once and for all. I would ask that you attend if you are willing, not as a warrior to be claimed, but as a witness whose perspective, however strange its origin, may prove useful to a council that has debated this matter for far too long without resolution. Kratos considered the request, weighing it against every instinct that told him to remain apart from this world's burdens. But he thought too of Frodo's pale, frightened face, of the wound that would not heal, of the particular courage it took for a creature so small and untested to carry a weight that had already broken stronger wills. He thought of his own son, and the war he had failed to keep from finding him. I will attend, Kratos said. Elrond inclined his head, something like grim gratitude passing across his ancient features, and left Kratos alone in the emptying chamber, the valley's waterfalls murmuring on beyond the open archways, indifferent to the weight of the decision being shaped within them. The council convened 3 days later in the same open hall, but this time the chamber was full, Every free people of Middle-earth represented, it seemed, in the grave and watchful faces arrayed around Elrond's seat. Kratos stood near the back, apart from the seated ranks, and watched the proceedings with the particular attentiveness of a man who had learned, across two dead pantheons, exactly how much could go wrong when powerful beings gathered to debate the fate of a cursed object. Frodo sat near the front, healed enough to attend though still pale, and it was he who ultimately placed the golden ring on a low stone pedestal at the chamber's center when Elrond called for it. Kratos felt it the moment it was uncovered, not a sound, not quite a sensation, but a kind of pressure at the edge of awareness, like a held breath in a room that should have been empty of one. He was not alone in feeling something. Half the chamber's occupants shifted almost imperceptibly, and Boromir's eyes fixed on the golden band with an intensity that made the old alarm in Kratos's chest sharpen into something closer to certainty. But what struck Kratos most was what he did not feel. Every account he had heard described the ring as a thing that reached for minds, that whispered promises tailored to each individual's deepest hungers. He felt none of that. The pressure he sensed was external, a disturbance in the air around the object, but the ring itself seemed, to his particular senses, curiously inert, a door that simply did not have a key shaped to fit his lock. He said nothing of this during the debate that followed, listening instead as the council argued the ring's fate with the circular, anguished logic of people who understood every option before them was terrible in its own particular way. Destroy it, and they must carry it into the heart of the enemy's own land to do so. Hide it, and it would eventually be found, given enough centuries and enough searching. Use it, as Boromir argued with increasing heat, and they doomed themselves to become exactly the tyranny they sought to prevent. It was only when the debate reached its most heated point, Boromir on his feet, voice raised, arguing that Gondor's need was too great to ignore the weapon sitting and used before them, that Kratos finally spoke. "You are wrong," he said, and the chamber's attention swung toward him with the suddenness of a struck bell. "Not about your need. I do not doubt Gondor bleeds. But about the object itself." He stepped forward, closer to the pedestal than anyone had come since Frodo placed the ring upon it, and felt every eye in the chamber track the movement with held breath. "I have handled cursed things before. Objects built from grief, from stolen divinity, from the concentrated will of beings who wanted power without limit. Every one of them offered something. A voice. A promise. A hunger disguised as opportunity." He looked down at the golden band, close enough now to feel that strange external pressure more sharply, though it still found no purchase in him. "This one offers me nothing. I feel it working at the edges of this room, searching for a grip, a hunger it can bargain with. It finds none in me, because the hungers I once carried were burned out of me long before I fell into your world. But I have watched enough men fall to promises like this to know its silence toward me changes nothing about its danger toward the rest of you." Boromir's expression had shifted from heated frustration to something more wary, watching Kratos with new and uncertain calculation. "If it cannot touch you," the man said slowly, "then perhaps you alone among us could carry it safely. Wield it even against the very enemy who forged it." "No." The word came out flat, immovable, and carried enough finality that even Boromir did not immediately press further. "I have seen what unlimited power does to those who wield it, even those who begin with the best intentions. I watched a king become a tyrant through fear alone, without any ring to corrupt him. I will not become your world's next cautionary tale simply because your enemy's curse cannot find purchase in whatever is left of me to corrupt." He turned to address the full chamber now. "That this thing cannot tempt me is not a gift to be exploited. It is, perhaps, the only honest counsel I can offer this council. Do not seek a shortcut through power you do not understand, simply because it appears for one man to be safe to hold. The road that seems safest is rarely the one that actually is." Gandalf, who had watched the exchange with careful, unreadable attention, finally spoke into the silence that followed. "The stranger speaks wisdom this council would do well to heed, whatever discomfort it causes those hoping for an easier path." He rose, addressing the chamber with the particular authority that came from centuries of hard-won caution. "The ring must be destroyed in the fire that forged it, and nowhere else will suffice. That is the only ending that does not, eventually, become another beginning for the same catastrophe." The argument that followed was fierce and long, but Kratos's words had shifted something in the chamber's momentum, the reckless hope that had briefly flickered in some faces, the idea that a shortcut might exist, guttered and did not fully reignite. By the time the council finally settled on its course, a small company to carry the ring into Mordor itself, to unmake it in the fires where it was forged, the debate had exhausted itself into grim, resolute agreement. It was Elrond who spoke the company's names one by one into the settling quiet. Frodo to bear the burden he had carried this far. Sam, his steadfast companion who would not be parted from him. Gandalf whose wisdom would guide them. Aragorn, and here Kratos finally learned the ranger's true name and lineage, spoken with a weight that reframed everything he had witnessed of Strider's quiet authority over the preceding days, heir to a throne long vacant, sworn now to see the ring's bearer safely to his task. Boromir, representing Gondor's stake in the outcome. Legolas, an elf whose bow Kratos had noted with quiet professional respect during the council's opening. Gimli, a dwarf whose fierce loyalty to the quest was evident even before his name was spoken. And the two remaining hobbits, Merry and Pippin, whose insistence on joining carried more stubborn courage than sense, by Kratos' estimation, though he said nothing to discourage it. 9 companions, against an enemy that commanded armies beyond counting. Kratos watched the company assemble with a particular familiar dread of a man who understood exactly how thin those odds were, and felt something old and reluctant stir in his chest. Not quite obligation, not quite the pull of a cause he had sworn to serve, but something close enough to unsettle him. It was Elrond who approached him after the council dispersed, finding Kratos alone at the edge of the valley's terraced gardens, watching the last light fade over the mountains to the east. "You will not be asked to join the fellowship," the elf lord said without preamble. "This council does not presume to claim your strength for a war you have said plainly is not yours. But I would be dishonest if I did not tell you that I believe your presence beside them would improve their chances considerably, whatever the cost to your own wishes." Kratos did not answer immediately, weighing the weight of what he had witnessed in that chamber, Frodo's pale, unshakable resolve, the strange inert silence the ring held toward him, the particular, familiar shape of a small company setting out against odds that should have been impossible. He thought of his son, of every promise he had failed to keep, of every war he had told himself was not his only to find its cost written in blood he could have prevented. "I told your council I would not swear myself to a war that was not mine," Kratos said finally. "That remains true. I will not march beside your fellowship as a soldier bound to their cause." He turned to meet Elrond's steady gaze. "But I have watched men fall to promises this ring offers. In wars I did fight, wars I told myself were mine because I could not walk away and live with what I saw. I do not yet know if this is such a war. I know only that I am not ready to decide tonight, that it is not." Elrond studied him a long moment, something like cautious understanding passing across his ancient features. "Then I will not press you further, stranger. But know that the road to Mordor is long and dark, and I suspect it will cross paths with whatever road you eventually choose to walk, whether either of us intends it or not." Below them, in the valley's gathering dusk, the small company of 9 made their final preparations for a road that would test every one of them past the limits of what any of them yet understood, and Kratos watched them with the particular, unwelcome weight of a man who suspected, however much he wished otherwise, that Elrond's warning would prove true long before this world's war reached its end. The morning the fellowship departed was gray and quiet, the valley's usual birdsong muted beneath low cloud that clung to the peaks like a held breath. Kratos stood apart from the small gathering that had assembled to see the 9 companions off, Elrond and his household, a scattering of elves whose faces carried the particular sorrow of those who understood, better than most, how rarely such quests ended in anything but grief. Frodo paused before him as the company made its final preparations, the hobbit's face pale but steady in a way that had grown more pronounced in the days since the council. "You're not coming?" Frodo said. It was not quite a question. "No," Kratos said. He crouched, bringing himself closer to the hobbit's eye level, an unfamiliar courtesy he found himself extending without entirely understanding why. "I told your council I would not swear myself to a war not mine to fight. That has not changed." Something flickered across Frodo's face, not accusation, but a kind of tired, resigned understanding that struck Kratos harder than anger would have. "Everyone keeps telling me this isn't their fight," the hobbit said quietly. "Gandalf says it. Aragorn says it, though he means something different by it. I don't think any of you understand that it doesn't matter whose fight it is. It's happening whether we choose it or not." Kratos held the boy's gaze and found, uncomfortably, that he had no ready answer to offer. He had spent 2 lifetimes telling himself the same lie Frodo had just dismantled with the plain, unadorned honesty only children and the truly desperate seemed capable of, that a war could be avoided simply by declaring oneself outside its borders. Every war he had ever fought had proven that lie false, eventually, at a cost he had never fully recovered from paying. "You are wiser than most of the grown men I have met in your world," Kratos said finally, "and mine." He straightened, the weight of the moment settling uncomfortably across his shoulders. I do not promise you my sword, Frodo. I promise you this much. I will not vanish into your world's forests and pretend I never met you. Whatever road I walk from here, I do not think it leads far from the one you're walking. It was, he recognized even as he said it, the closest thing to a commitment he had offered anyone since falling into this world, and he watched the small flicker of relief cross the hobbit's face with a complicated mixture of satisfaction and unease. He had made promises like this before. They had a way of costing more than intended. Aragorn approached as the company made ready to depart, offering nothing so formal as a farewell, only a brief, measuring look that had become familiar over the preceding days. You could still change your mind, the ranger said. The road allows for that even after the company sets out. I know, Kratos said. I do not intend to use it yet. Aragorn's mouth twitched, something almost like a smile beneath the weight of the morning's grim purpose. Then I will simply say this, stranger, and let it be enough. Whatever path you choose from here, I do not think our roads have finished crossing. Middle-earth is smaller than it looks on a map, for men who matter to its outcome. The company set out shortly after, moving south along paths Gandalf had chosen with careful deliberation, and Kratos watched them go from the valley's edge until the mist swallowed the last of them from sight. Something in his chest sat heavy and unresolved as the sound of their passage faded. Not quite regret, not quite relief, but the particular discomfort of a man who had refused a call he suspected, with grim certainty, he had not heard the last of. He remained in Rivendell 3 days longer, turning over the shape of his own path in the valley's quiet gardens, before finally seeking out Elrond to take his leave. You mean to wander then, Elrond said, when Kratos explained his intent to travel Middle-earth's roads independently rather than remain sheltered within Rivendell's borders. Without destination, without allegiance. I have spent my life without either more often than with, Kratos said. I do not know this world well enough yet to choose a side in its war. I mean to learn it, its peoples, its dangers, the true shape of the threat your council fears, before I decide what role, if any, I am meant to play in it. Elrond studied him with the same careful, ageless attention he had offered since their first meeting. That is a more honest answer than most who claim neutrality manage to offer, the Elf Lord said. I will not press you toward a different course. But I would offer counsel if you are willing to hear it. The roads east and south grow more dangerous with each passing week, and the enemy's servants are not the only threat you will encounter. Saruman's ambitions have made Isengard's borders treacherous for any traveler, however powerful, and the wild men of Dunland and the Borderlands owe allegiance to no one's peace but their own hunger. Choose your roads with more care than you have shown choosing your battles, stranger. Middle-earth does not forgive carelessness, whatever strength the traveler carries. Kratos accepted the warning with a nod, gathering the few supplies Rivendell stores had offered him, dried provisions, a cloak better suited to the world's climate than the tattered remnants of what he'd fallen through the rift wearing, and set out from the valley the following dawn, taking a road that curved south and east, away from the Fellowship's chosen path but not, he suspected, entirely divergent from it. The country beyond Rivendell's borders grew wilder with every mile, forests giving way to open moorland scarred by old battles whose stones and cairns spoke of centuries of conflict Kratos had no context for but recognized instinctively in the shape of the land itself. Every world he had known carried its scars the same way, etched into earth that remembered violence long after the mortals who caused it had turned to dust. It was on the 4th day of solitary travel, as dusk settled purple and cold across a valley he had no name for, that Kratos first felt something watching him that was not merely animal. He had grown accustomed, in his time in this world, to the particular texture of mortal fear and mortal caution, the wary attention of travelers who recognized a stranger's danger and gave him wide berth. This was different. This was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the evening air, a pressure at the edge of awareness that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the sensation the ring had produced in Rivendell's council chamber, except sharper now, more directed, more hungry. He stopped walking, the Leviathan axe coming free of its harness without conscious thought, and turned slowly to face the ridge behind him, where the last light of the setting sun cast long shadows between wind-bent trees. A figure sat astride a horse black as pitch, unmoving at the ridge's crest, cloaked head to foot in tattered gray that seemed, even from this distance, to swallow the fading light rather than reflect it. Kratos could make out no face beneath the hood, no features at all, only an absence where a face should have been, and the cold pressure he had felt grew sharper, more insistent, the closer his attention fixed on the figure. It did not move. It did not speak. It simply watched him, and Kratos understood, with the particular certainty of a warrior who had faced enough uncanny things to recognize another, that whatever this creature was, it had not found him by accident. He held his ground, the axe steady in his grip, and waited to see what the darkness had sent to test him. The Nazgul did not attack immediately. It simply watched, and Kratos watched back, and in that mutual stillness he felt the cold pressure sharpen into something more deliberate. A testing, almost as though the creature were probing the edges of him the way a blade might probe for weakness in armor. He had faced terror before. Not the ordinary fear of mortal men, but weaponized dread, forces designed specifically to unmake courage before a single blow was struck. He had walked through the realm of the dead and felt its particular despair reach for his mind with grasping, hopeless fingers. He had faced the screaming madness Ares once wielded to break armies before they ever reached the battlefield. Whatever this creature was attempting, it was not new to him, and he recognized with grim satisfaction that the recognition itself seemed to blunt its effect. The horse began to descend the ridge at an unhurried walk, and as it came, Kratos felt the temperature of the air itself seem to drop, the wind carrying a smell like old grave earth and rusted iron. The figure atop it raised one gloved hand, and a blade slid free from beneath the tattered cloak, black, wickedly curved, humming with a malice that had weight and texture, a physical pressure against Kratos' senses. "You are not the halfling," the creature said, and its voice was wrong in a way that made the hair on Kratos' neck rise. Not a single voice but several, layered atop each other, speaking in unison from a throat that should not have been capable of the sound. "Yet you carry something old. Something the master would wish to know of." "Your master will learn nothing from me," Kratos said, "except how quickly I can end what you are." The Nazgul's blade came down in a strike that should have, by every account Kratos had heard of these creatures, carried terror sufficient to freeze a company of soldiers where they stood. Kratos simply stepped aside, catching the black blade on the haft of the Leviathan axe, and drove his shoulder into the horse's flank hard enough to stagger the animal sideways, sending its rider scrambling to keep his seat. The wraith recovered with unnatural speed, wheeling the horse back around, and this time it did not strike with the blade alone. It screamed, a sound that tore through the evening air with a force that should have shattered Kratos' resolve into gibbering panic. He felt the edges of the sound try to find purchase in him, searching for the fear it was built to exploit, and found, as the ring had found in Rivendell, remarkably little to grip. He had already lost everything this creature's scream was built to threaten him with. He had already buried a wife, a daughter, a world. There was no deeper fear left in him for a ghost shriek to unearth. "You waste your breath," Kratos said, and closed the distance between them before the wraith could recover from its own scream's futility. The fight that followed was brief and brutal. The Nazgul's blade was fast, faster than any mortal weapon Kratos had faced, its curved edge seeking gaps in his guard with an unnatural, predatory precision. But speed alone had never been enough to end Kratos' life in two collapsed pantheons, and he met the creature's strikes with the accumulated brutality of centuries, the Leviathan axe answering each attack with frost-edged force that began gradually to drive the wraith backward. It was the blades of chaos that ended the encounter. Kratos releasing the axe to embed itself in the frozen earth and drawing the chained blades in a single fluid motion, hurling them wide to wrap around the wraith's sword arm before the creature could react. He pulled hard, and the black blade tore free of a grip that should have been supernaturally strong, clattering uselessly into the frost-rimed grass. The wraith did not flee immediately, though Kratos sensed in the sudden stillness of its posture, something that might have been the closest thing to surprise a being like this was capable of feeling. It stared at him, faceless, and yet somehow conveying an unmistakable and growing wariness, before wheeling its black horse and vanishing back over the ridge in a rush of cold wind and receding malice, leaving only the fading echo of its passage and Kratos' own steady breathing in the darkening valley. He stood a long moment in the aftermath, the blades of chaos coiling back to his hips, the Leviathan axe pulled free of the earth with a groan of frost. He did not know precisely what he had just fought. Elrond's council had spoken of servants of the enemy in vague, careful terms, but nothing had prepared him for the particular weaponized despair the creature had wielded, nor for the fact that it had come looking for him specifically, drawn by whatever power it had sensed in the days since his arrival. That, more than the fight itself, troubled him as he made camp that night in a shallow cave carved into the valley's rocky slope. If servants of the enemy were already hunting him, not the ring, not the fellowship, but him specifically, then his hope of remaining an unaligned observer, learning this world's shape before choosing a side in its war, had likely already expired without his consent. He thought of Frodo's words at their parting. "It doesn't matter whose fight it is. It's happening whether we choose it or not." The boy's plain, unadorned wisdom sat uncomfortably in his chest now, proven true faster than Kratos had wanted to admit possible. He did not sleep that night, keeping watch instead at the cave's mouth, the Leviathan axe across his knees, and found himself turning over, for the first time since falling into this world, the question of what exactly he had sensed in that wraith's presence. Not merely malice, but a kind of directed hunger, a master's interest reaching through a servant's eyes toward something the master did not yet understand and clearly wished to. Far to the east, in a tower of unblinking black stone, that same hunger sharpened into something closer to certainty. A piece had entered the board that matched no shape the watching eye had accounted for, a power that did not answer to the ring's pull, that had bested one of the 9 in single combat without visible effort, that had appeared from nowhere in the weeks since the enemy's own strength had begun its long-planned resurgence. Such a piece could not be ignored. It would need to be understood, contained, or destroyed, and the eye that had spent millennia patient in its hatred began, for the first time in a great while, to feel something uncomfortably close to uncertainty about which of those 3 outcomes it could actually guarantee. Kratos, unaware of the attention now sharpening toward him from the heart of Mordor itself, kept his silent watch through the cold hours before dawn, and resolved, as the first gray light crept over the eastern hills, that whatever war this world was fighting had, whether he willed it or not, already begun to fight him back. Word of the Nazgul encounter reached Rivendell before Kratos did. He learned this only later from Elrond himself, who explained that the elves maintained subtler means of watching the roads than ordinary scouts. What mattered more immediately was the messenger who found him on the eastern road 3 days after the fight, a rider in grey livery bearing a token Kratos did not recognize but whose bearer clearly expected to be taken seriously. Lord Saruman of Isengard extends an invitation, the rider said, reining his horse to a stop a cautious distance away. He has heard tell of a stranger who bested one of the 9 in single combat, and wishes to speak with such a being directly on matters of mutual interest. Kratos studied the messenger for a long moment, weighing the offer against everything Elrond and Gandalf had told him of Saruman, once the White Council's leader, now revealed as a traitor whose ambitions had aligned, however uneasily, with the enemy's own. Your master's interests and mine are unlikely to be mutual, Kratos said. Lord Saruman does not ask for allegiance, the messenger replied, clearly rehearsed in this particular negotiation. Only conversation. He has knowledge of your circumstance that even the wise of Rivendell may lack, knowledge of the roads between worlds, and how a being such as yourself might find passage home again, should you wish it. That gave Kratos pause in a way the messenger's other words had not. He had not spoken of his desire to return home aloud since Rivendell's council, but the possibility sat in him always, a low persistent ache beneath the daily business of navigating this strange world. The idea that Saruman, whatever his corruption, might genuinely possess knowledge relevant to that ache was not something he could dismiss purely on principle, however much every instinct honed by centuries of manipulation told him this was precisely the kind of offer that preceded a trap. I will hear what your master has to say, Kratos said finally. That is not the same as trusting it. The Tower of Orthanc rose from the ruin of Isengard's once fair valley like a black blade thrust up through violated earth, and Kratos approached it 3 days later with every sense alert, cataloging the industry that had transformed the valley into something closer to a forge than a garden. Pits and furnaces, the ceaseless labor of creatures bred rather than born, the particular stink of ambition that had abandoned all pretense of restraint. Saruman received him at the tower's base rather than within it, a courtesy Kratos suspected was calculated rather than genuine, a wizard's habit of controlling the terms of every meeting, even the location. The white wizard was tall, robed in colors that shifted subtly in the light, his voice when he spoke carrying a smooth, persuasive warmth that Kratos recognized instantly as a weapon in its own right, more dangerous in its way than any blade. You are further from home than any traveler I have encountered in a long study of such matters, Saruman said without preamble, his pale eyes taking in every detail of Kratos's bearing with obvious, careful calculation. A being untouched by the ring's influence, immune to the Nazgul's terror, wielding power that answers to no source I recognize in all my studies of this world's ancient magics. You are, if I am not mistaken, precisely the kind of variable that could reshape the coming war's outcome entirely. I have no interest in reshaping your war, Kratos said. I was told you have knowledge of the roads between worlds. That is the only matter I came to discuss. Something flickered across Saruman's composed features, not quite disappointment, but the recalibration of a negotiator whose opening gambit had failed to land. I do possess such knowledge, the wizard said. Fragments of it, gathered across long study of the Palantiri and older lore besides. The paths between realities are not so easily traveled as the paths between mere kingdoms, but they are not entirely closed to one who understands their nature. I could aid you in finding your way home, stranger. In time. With study and resource and, here the pause carried deliberate weight, cooperation. Cooperation, Kratos repeated flatly. The enemy in the east grows in strength daily, Saruman said, moving now with the fluid persuasion Kratos suspected had bent stronger wills than his own. Rivendell's council, wise as it believes itself, pursues a fool's errand, destroying the ring rather than claiming its power for the forces still capable of standing against Sauron. I offer a different path. Together, your strength and my knowledge, we could claim that power before the halfling's folly destroys the one weapon capable of ending this war on terms favorable to the free peoples. I could then turn my full attention to the far more interesting question of returning you to your own world, unburdened by the demands of a war you did not choose. Kratos studied the wizard for a long moment, weighing the offer against everything he had learned, not just from Elrond and Gandalf's warnings, but from his own bitter experience of exactly this kind of bargain. He had heard variations of this exact speech before, from beings far older and more practiced in manipulation than Saruman appeared to be. Ares had offered him power in exchange for service. Zeus had offered him mercy in exchange for obedience. Every god he had ever killed had, at some point, offered him precisely this shape of bargain, power and reward, wrapped around a demand that would have made him complicit in exactly the kind of tyranny he despised. You want me to help you claim a weapon that corrupts everyone who touches it, Kratos said, so that you can use it to seize power your own council would deny you. And you offer, in exchange, help I have no proof you can actually provide, contingent entirely on my continued usefulness to your ambitions. He shook his head slowly. I have made this exact bargain before, wizard, in different words with different faces. It never ends the way the one offering the bargain claims it will. Saruman's composed expression finally cracked, just slightly, irritation bleeding through the careful persuasion. You would refuse a path home out of what, principle? Sentiment for people who are not your own, in a war that is not your own. I would refuse a path built on the same corruption I already told your council I would not add to my own burden, Kratos said. If you have genuine knowledge of the roads between worlds, offer it freely, and I will judge its worth on its own merits. But I will not trade my strength for it, nor lend my hand to a war I do not yet understand well enough to judge, and I will certainly not help you claim a weapon that every wise voice I have met in this world has warned me corrupts absolutely. Then you are a fool, Saruman said, the warmth gone entirely now, replaced by something colder, more calculating. And you will watch this war unfold exactly as Rivendell's council intends, slowly, agonizingly, at a cost measured in thousands of lives that a swifter, harder path could have spared. I hope, stranger, that your principles keep you warm when that cost comes due. They have kept me alive through worse costs than your threats suggest, Kratos said, and turned to leave, the weight of Orthink's shadow falling away behind him as he crossed back through the ruined valley, past the pits and furnaces of Saruman's ceaseless, hungry industry. He did not look back, though he felt Saruman's gaze following him long after the tower itself had fallen out of sight, and he understood, with the particular grim certainty of a man who had made enemies of gods before, that he had just made one of a wizard who did not forgive refusal easily. The retaliation did not come immediately. It came 3 weeks later, in the borderlands between Rohan and Isengard's shadow, where Kratos had made camp near a village whose name he had not yet learned, a scattering of thatched homes and worked fields tucked into a valley that had, until recently, considered itself far enough from the war's fronts to remain untouched by it. He smelled the smoke before he saw it, acrid and wrong in a way that wood smoke never was, and by the time he crested the ridge above the village, the first buildings were already burning, and the raiders responsible for it were visible in the firelight, not orcs this time but men, wild-eyed and armor-clad in the crude iron of Dunland's hill tribes, moving through the village with the particular brutal efficiency of soldiers under orders rather than mere raiders seeking plunder. Kratos descended the ridge at a dead run, the Leviathan axe already in hand, and it was only as he closed on the village's edge that he understood the shape of what he was witnessing. Not a random raid but a message sent by a wizard whose pride had been wounded and who understood, with cold precision, exactly which pressure point would draw a reluctant stranger back into a war he had tried to remain apart from. The first of the raiders never saw him coming. The axe took the man's legs from under him before he registered the threat, and Kratos was already moving toward the next before the first scream had fully left his throat. He fought through the village's narrow lanes with a controlled, methodical violence, cutting down every armed raider he encountered while sparing every villager who crossed his path, hauling a child bodily out of a collapsing doorway with one hand while his axe found a raider's throat with the other. It was in the village's central square, where a knot of villagers had been herded together at spear point by a dozen of the raiders' leaders, that Kratos found the true shape of the message Saruman had intended. One of the raiders, better armored than the rest, clearly an officer of some kind, held a blade to the throat of an old woman kneeling in the square's center, and called out to Kratos as he approached. "Lord Saruman sends his regards," the officer said, his accent thick but the words clearly rehearsed, meant to be delivered precisely. "He says to tell you, this is what your principles cost when you refuse a wizard's hospitality. He says there will be more villages, more costs until you reconsider his offer." Kratos stopped, the axe steady in his grip, weighing the situation with the cold calculation of a man who had faced hostage-takers before, in wars he remembered with far more bitterness than this one had yet earned. "Release her," he said, "and I will let the rest of you leave this village alive. That is the only offer I intend to make." The officer laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You are not the one giving orders here, stranger. Lower your weapon or the old woman dies first and then." He did not finish the sentence. Kratos closed the distance in a single burst of motion too fast for the officer to track, the blades of chaos lashing out to wrap around the man's sword arm and yank the blade away from the woman's throat before it could complete its stroke. The officer's death came a half-second later, the Leviathan axe finding his chest with a force that ended the threat instantly and completely. The remaining raiders broke and fled at the sight of their leader's death, scattering into the smoke-wreathed darkness beyond the village's edge, and Kratos let most of them go, choosing instead to see to the wounded, to help extinguish the fire still consuming a handful of the village's homes, to sit with the old woman he had saved while her trembling slowly subsided. It was hours later, once the worst of the immediate crisis had passed, that the village's headman found Kratos at its edge, surveying the damage with an expression the old man clearly struggled to read. "We owe you our lives," the headman said. "All of us. I do not know what you are, stranger, or why the White Wizard's men spoke your name with such hatred, but this village will not forget what you did tonight." Kratos said nothing for a long moment, watching the last embers of a burned granary smolder against the darkness, weighing the true cost of what had just occurred. 12 villagers dead before he arrived. Homes destroyed. A message sent, precisely as intended, that his refusal of Saruman's bargain would be paid for in blood that was not his own to spend. "I did not do enough," Kratos said finally, more to himself than to the headman. "I arrived after the burning began. 12 of your people died before I ever crossed that ridge." "You arrived before all of us died," the headman said, with the particular blunt wisdom of someone who had survived enough tragedy to understand its arithmetic clearly. "That is not nothing, stranger, whatever guilt you are carrying about the ones you couldn't save in time." Kratos absorbed this without immediate response, though something in the old man's words settled uncomfortably alongside the fury he had been carrying since Saruman's officer delivered his message. He had spent his life measuring his failures in exactly these terms. The ones he arrived too late to save, weighed against the ones he managed to protect, and found the ledger always tilted toward grief regardless of how many he ultimately rescued. He remained in the village 3 more days, helping rebuild what fire had destroyed, before setting out once more on roads that now carried a different weight than before. Saruman's message had been received, precisely as the wizard intended, not a capitulation but a clarification. This was not, whatever Kratos had told himself in the weeks since Rivendell, a war he could observe from its margins. Refusal itself had become an act with consequences, and the villages scattered across Middle-earth's contested borderlands would continue paying the price of his principles whether he acknowledged the debt or not. He thought, as he walked the borderlands roads with grimmer purpose than before, of Frodo's words again, "It doesn't matter whose fight it is," and understood now, with the particular bitter clarity that came only from watching innocents bleed for a choice not their own, exactly how thoroughly right the Hobbit had been. Behind him, in the Black Tower of Orthanc, Saruman watched the reports of the stranger's continued interference with the same careful, patient calculation he applied to every piece on his board, already turning his attention toward a strategy less crude than burning villages, a plan that would require more subtlety, more patience, but that promised, if executed correctly, to either bend this unclassifiable stranger to his purposes or remove him from the war's equation entirely. The subtlety Saruman turned to came in the form of Uruk-hai, not the crude hillmen of the borderland raid, but Isengard's finest, bred specifically for war, faster and stronger and more disciplined than any orc-kind Kratos had yet encountered. They found him on the eaves of a vast ancient forest that the locals called Fangorn, a place that unsettled Kratos in ways he could not immediately articulate, a watchfulness in the trees themselves, a sense of ancient awareness that had nothing to do with any enemy he could name. The Uruk-hai company numbered perhaps 40, moving with the coordinated discipline of soldiers rather than the disorganized frenzy of the orc pack he had faced in his first hours in this world, and their captain, a scarred, brutal creature who carried himself with the particular confidence of something bred specifically to kill, addressed him before the fighting began, in the crude but functional speech of Isengard's chain of command. Saruman wants you broken, the captain said, not killed outright if it can be managed. He says a broken tool serves better than a dead one. The creature's grin bared filed teeth. But he also says if breaking proves too costly, killing will do. Come and try, Kratos said, and the forest's edge became a battlefield. It was, from the first exchange, a harder fight than anything he had faced since arriving in this world. The Uruk-hai fought with genuine skill, coordinated tactics, weapons forged for exactly this kind of engagement, and their numbers meant that even Kratos' considerable strength was tested in ways the scattered orc packs and single Nazgul had not managed. He fought through the forest's eaves in a controlled retreat, using the ancient trees as cover and obstacle both, cutting down Uruk after Uruk while their numbers slowly, methodically, tried to encircle him. It was in the deeper shadow of the forest, as the fighting drove him further from the eaves than he intended, that Kratos began to feel something shift in the trees themselves, not merely ancient awareness now but active hostile attention, directed not at him but at the Uruk-hai pursuing him. Branches that should not have moved in the still forest air groaned and twisted, roots seemed to shift beneath the soldiers' feet at precisely the moments that mattered most, and more than once Kratos watched an Uruk-hai stumble into what should have been simple terrain, as though the forest itself had reached out to trip him. He did not question the aid, whatever its source, using the confusion it sowed among his pursuers to press his advantage, the Leviathan axe and blades of chaos working in brutal tandem to whittle the company's numbers down with methodical, relentless violence. By the time the surviving Uruk-hai broke and fled back toward Isengard's borders, perhaps a dozen of the original 40 by Kratos' rough count, he stood alone in a forest clearing that felt, in the sudden quiet, less like a battlefield and more like a space that had been deliberately, carefully cleared for exactly this confrontation. You fight well for a thing that does not belong to these woods. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound like the groaning of ancient wood given shape and intention, and Kratos turned to find himself facing something that had not been there a moment before, or perhaps had always been there, and simply chosen this moment to reveal itself. It stood twice his height, shaped roughly like a man if a man had been grown from oak and moss and centuries of patient, rooted stillness, its eyes deep-set and ancient beneath a craggy brow of bark and lichen. You aided me, Kratos said. It was not quite a question. I did not aid you, the creature replied, its voice slow and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of long consideration. I removed a blight from my forest's eaves. That your fight and my purpose aligned with circumstance, not alliance. The ancient being studied him with unhurried, patient attention. I am called Treebeard by those who bother to shorten what deserves to be spoken fully. I have watched the shape of this world change for longer than your kind's memory extends, stranger, and I confess I have not yet decided what shape you represent in that change. I do not yet know myself, Kratos said, and found to his mild surprise, that the admission came easily to something that felt, despite its alien shape, oddly trustworthy in its careful, deliberate honesty. I fell into this world from another, weeks past. I have tried to remain apart from its war. That effort has not succeeded. Few efforts to remain apart from war succeed in my long experience of such things, Treebeard said. The wizard who sent those creatures against you has grown careless of late, careless of the old boundaries, careless of the forest he once respected, careless of consequences that patient things such as myself remember long after quicker minds have moved on to new schemes. Something that might have been the ghost of anger passed through the ancient being's craggy features, slow and geological in its shifting. He has been cutting my trees, stranger. Burning them for his furnaces, feeding his industry with wood that took centuries to grow and will take centuries more to replace, if it is ever replaced at all. I have watched this violation for longer than my patience, considerable as it is, can continue to tolerate. Kratos considered this, understanding with growing clarity, the shape of an alliance neither of them had explicitly proposed but that circumstance seemed determined to construct regardless of either party's stated intentions. Saruman has made an enemy of you, he said. Saruman has made an enemy of every root and branch within a day's walk of his tower, Treebeard said. I have simply been slower than I perhaps should have been in deciding what that enmity requires of me. The ancient being's deep-set eyes fixed on Kratos with renewed, considering attention. You have already made that decision, it seems, whatever your professed neutrality. The wizard does not send 40 Uruk-hai after a stranger he considers no threat to his ambitions. He offered me a bargain, Kratos said. I refused it. This is his answer to that refusal. Then perhaps, Treebeard said slowly, each word weighted with the particular gravity of a being whose decisions were rarely made in haste, our purposes have more in common than either of us initially recognized. I have long considered whether the time has come to remind Isengard's wizard that not every ancient thing in this world has grown too slow, or too patient, to act against violation of what it protects. The creature's craggy face shifted into something that might, on a being built from bark and moss, have approximated a grim and considering smile. Walk with me a while, stranger, if your road allows it. I find myself curious to hear more of the world you fell from, and I suspect you may find my own perspective on the wizard's ambitions useful, should you choose, eventually, to act against them more directly than a single refused bargain. Kratos studied the ancient being for a long moment, weighing the offer against the accumulated weight of every choice he had made since falling into this world. The refusals, the reluctant interventions, the slow, grinding realization that neutrality itself had become, whether he willed it or not, a kind of participation in a war he could no longer credibly claim was not his own. I will walk with you, Kratos said finally, and fell into step beside the ancient, patient fury of Fangorn's oldest guardian, moving deeper into a forest that had, in the span of a single afternoon's violence, shifted from unfamiliar threat into something closer to reluctant, complicated alliance. The days that followed his meeting with Treebeard passed in a strange, unhurried rhythm entirely unlike anything Kratos had experienced since falling into this world. The ancient being moved through Fangorn's depths at a pace that would have frustrated any mortal companion, pausing sometimes for what felt like hours to consider a single question Kratos had asked in passing, and in that enforced patience, Kratos found himself talking more openly than he had with anyone since Rivendell. About Sparta, about Olympus's fall, about the son he had failed and the wife and daughter whose deaths still haunted the quiet spaces behind his eyes. Treebeard listened to all of it with the particular unhurried attention of a being who measured time in centuries rather than days, offering little judgment but occasional, startlingly precise observations that suggested a depth of understanding Kratos had not expected from something that looked, to a casual glance, like an animated tree. Your rage is old, the Ent said on the fourth day of their slow passage through the forest, older than the grief that first kindled it, I think. It has become something you carry rather than something you feel, and I wonder if you have considered what happens to a fire that burns without ever being permitted to simply burn out. Kratos had no ready answer for this, and the question sat with him uneasily as they continued deeper into Fangorn's ancient heart, toward a gathering Treebeard had spoken of with growing, deliberate purpose. An Entmoot, a council of his own kind, called to decide whether the forest's patient guardians would finally act against Isengard's growing violation of their ancient home. It was on the sixth day as they approached the Moot's gathering place, that the question found its brutal answer. They came upon the clearing first by smell, burning wood, but wrong, accelerant-soaked and deliberate, the particular reek of arson rather than accident, and then by sight, a swath of Fangorn's ancient trees, some of them centuries old by Treebeard's own reckoning, reduced to smoldering stumps and ash by a raiding party that had clearly anticipated the forest's growing hostility and struck first, deep into territory Isengard's forces had never dared enter before. Treebeard's reaction was immediate and total, a roar that shook the surrounding canopy, ancient limbs uprooting from soil that had held them still for centuries as the Ents surged toward the destruction with a speed Kratos would not have credited to something built from wood and stone. But it was what Kratos found at the clearing's edge that broke something loose in him that Treebeard's earlier question had only begun to probe. A sapling grove, young trees barely decades old, that Treebeard had spoken of during their journey with something approaching paternal tenderness, trees he had personally tended and protected through their first fragile centuries of growth, lay entirely destroyed, cut and burned with a thoroughness that suggested deliberate cruelty rather than simple military necessity. And scattered among the wreckage, the bodies of smaller creatures, Entings, Treebeard had called them, the forest's youngest and most vulnerable guardians, too young yet to defend themselves against soldiers who had clearly been ordered to show no restraint. Something in Kratos went very quiet and then very loud all at once. He did not remember later the specific moment his control slipped. He remembered the first Uruk-hai he found, one of the raiding party's rearguard, still setting fires to a stand of younger trees, and he remembered the axe finding the creature with a violence that went beyond combat necessity into something closer to obliteration. He remembered the second and the third, each death more brutal than strictly required, driven by a rage that had stopped calculating threat and started simply, purely destroying. By the time awareness fully returned to him, he was standing in a clearing soaked in more blood than the raiding party's number should have accounted for, his own breathing ragged, the blades of chaos still smoking with barely restrained fury, and Treebeard was watching him with an expression that mixed something like understanding with something closer to genuine alarm. "Stranger," the Ent said, slowly, carefully, the way one might address something dangerous and unpredictable rather than the companion he had walked beside for 6 days. "The threat is ended. You may stop now." Kratos looked down at his own hands, at the blood soaking them past the wrist, and felt the rage that had consumed him in the clearing's fury begin gradually to recede, leaving behind not satisfaction but a hollow, familiar horror that he recognized from 100 battlefields across 2 dead worlds. He had lost himself. Not merely fought with anger but disappeared entirely into it, the way he had disappeared into it climbing Olympus's slopes toward Zeus, the way he had disappeared into it more times than he could comfortably count across a life defined too often by exactly this failure of restraint. "I am sorry," he said, and the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them, addressed as much to himself as to the ancient being watching him with careful, patient concern. "I lost control of myself. I have watched rage consume lesser things than what walks in you," Treebeard said, "and I have watched it consume greater things too in ages before your kind's memory. It is not my place to judge what grief and loss have made of you, stranger. But I will say this plainly because I suspect no one has said it to you plainly enough in whatever life you carried before this one. A fire that burns without limit does not distinguish between the wood that threatens the forest and the wood that does not. You ended this threat thoroughly. I do not doubt that. But I watched something in you that frightened me more than Isengard's soldiers ever have, and I have walked this world since before your enemy's ring was ever forged." The words landed with more weight than any rebuke Kratos had received since falling into this world, precisely because they carried no judgment, only careful, ancient observation. The same unhurried honesty Treebeard had offered throughout their journey, applied now to the thing Kratos feared most about himself. "I have killed gods with this rage," Kratos said quietly, the confession costing him more than he expected. "I do not always know, once it takes hold, where the line sits between the killing that is necessary and the killing that is simply the rage finding an outlet. I have crossed that line before. I fear I crossed it again today." "Then perhaps," Treebeard said, "the question you should be asking is not whether your strength belongs in this war, stranger, but whether you have learned enough, in whatever grief shaped you, to wield that strength without it eventually consuming everything you meant to protect alongside everything you meant to destroy." The ancient being's deep-set eyes studied the wreckage of the sapling grove with visible, geological sorrow. "I do not say this to condemn you. I say it because I have decided, watching you these 6 days, that your presence in this war is no longer a question I intend to leave undecided. But I would have you enter it with your eyes open to the cost your own fire carries, alongside the cost of the enemy you mean to spend it against." Kratos looked around the ruined clearing, the burned saplings, the small bodies of Entings too young to have deserved this fate, the excessive violence of his own retaliation scattered among the legitimate dead, and felt, for the first time since arriving in this strange, star-wrong world, the full weight of Treebeard's earlier question settle into something he could no longer avoid examining. He had told himself, across 2 collapsed pantheons, that his rage was a tool he had learned to master. Fangorn's ruined grove told a different, more honest story. The Entmoot, when it finally convened 3 days later, was unlike any council Kratos had witnessed in this world or the 2 he had left behind. It took the better part of a full day merely to gather the Ents from across Fangorn's vast expanse, ancient beings who moved with a deliberation that made even Treebeard's careful pace seem hasty by comparison, and it took the remainder of that day and most of the next for the moot itself to reach anything resembling a decision. Kratos was not permitted to speak in the council proper. This was, Treebeard explained with careful courtesy, a matter for the forest's own kind to decide, whatever role the stranger's presence might have played in hastening it. He waited instead at the moot's edge, watching ancient beings debate in a language of groans and creaks and long, considering silences that stretched sometimes for hours between exchanges, and found himself, despite the strangeness of it, oddly at peace in the waiting. There was something in the Ent's unhurried deliberation that reminded him, distantly, of a wisdom he had rarely encountered among the gods he'd known, patience not as weakness but as its own form of strength, care taken precisely because the stakes were understood to be permanent. When the decision finally came, it came not as a vote but as a kind of collective, geological shift in mood, ancient limbs straightening, roots pulling free of soil that had held them still for decades, a sound like a mountain range deciding, all at once, to become an army. "We march on Isengard," Treebeard told him, and there was something in the old Ent's voice that carried both grim resolve and a note of genuine ancient sorrow, the sound of a being who had hoped, across centuries of patient restraint, never to be forced into precisely this choice. The wizard has cut too deep into what we protect. It is time he learned that even patient things have limits. Kratos fell in beside the marching ants as they moved toward Isengard's ruined valley, and it was during that march, slow by any mortal reckoning, but carrying an unstoppable, inexorable weight that made Kratos understand viscerally why Saruman's soldiers would eventually break and flee before it. That a rider found them, cutting across the forest's eaves at a desperate gallop. It was one of Aragorn's kinsmen, the same ranger woman who had spoken to Kratos around that first fire outside Bree, and her face carried the particular exhausted urgency of someone who had ridden hard and long with news that could not wait. Rohan is besieged, she said, reining her horse to a stop before Kratos with barely controlled panic. Saruman's army marches on Helm's Deep even now, 10,000 Uruk-hai, more than the Deep's garrison can hope to withstand. King Theoden has rallied what forces remain to him, but Aragorn fears the fortress will fall before dawn without aid he does not know how to summon in time. The news landed in Kratos with a complicated, immediate weight. 10,000 soldiers. A fortress he had never seen, defended by people he had never met, in a war he had spent weeks telling himself was not fully his own. And yet the calculation that followed was not, he realized with something like surprise, a calculation at all. It was simply, instantly, obvious. How far is this Helm's Deep? He asked. A hard day's ride, perhaps less if the roads are clear, the ranger said. But you have no horse, and even the fastest rider could not. I do not need a horse to arrive before dawn, Kratos said, and something in his flat, certain tone made the ranger's protest die unspoken. He turned to Treebeard, who had halted the Ent army's march to observe the exchange with careful, ancient attention. Your war with Isengard is your own to finish, Kratos said. I do not ask you to divert it. But I have another war to attend tonight, and I do not intend to arrive too late to matter. Go, stranger, Treebeard said, and something in the old Ent's craggy features carried what might, on a being built from bark and centuries, have approximated genuine respect. I think you have learned, faster than most of your fire-driven kind manage, exactly what your strength is meant to be used for. Isengard will still be here when your other battle is finished, if you find yourself with cause to return to it. Kratos did not wait for further ceremony. He set out from Fangorn's eaves at a pace no mortal runner could have sustained, the Leviathan axis frost aiding his stride with each stride, cutting cross-country rather than following the winding roads a horse would require, driving himself through the darkening hours toward a fortress and a siege he had never seen but understood, with grim and total certainty. He could not afford to arrive at too late. The land blurred past him, forests giving way to open plain, plain giving way to the rising foothills that marked Rohan's western borders, and as the hours wore on and the moon rose high and cold overhead, Kratos found himself thinking, unbidden, of every siege he had broken in 2 dead pantheons, every wall he had climbed, every impossible odds he had turned through sheer, unrelenting violence applied at exactly the moment it mattered most. He had told himself for weeks now, that this world's war was not his to fight. He understood now, running through the dark toward 10,000 soldiers bearing down on a fortress full of people he had never met, that the distinction had stopped mattering somewhere between Fangorn's burned sapling grove and this moment, that whatever line he had once drawn between his own wars and this world's had dissolved, quietly and completely, without his fully noticing the moment it happened. He crested the final ridge above the deep as the first gray suggestion of dawn touched the eastern sky, and what he saw below staggered even his considerable experience of warfare's scale. The fortress sat nestled in a mountain gorge, its outer wall, the deeping wall he would later learn it was called, already breached in one section, Uruk-hai pouring through the gap in numbers that dwarfed anything the defenders could hope to hold against. Fires burned along the ramparts. The sound of battle carried up the gorge in a continuous, overwhelming roar of steel and screaming and the particular percussive thunder of a siege reaching its breaking point. He did not hesitate at the sight of it. He descended the ridge at a dead run, the Leviathan axe already leaving frost in the pre-dawn air, and threw himself into the breach in the deeping wall with a violence that stopped the Uruk-hai advance in its tracks. Not through strategy, not through numbers, but through the simple brutal fact of a single warrior who did not tire, did not falter, and did not stop killing everything that came within reach of his axe. He fought through the breach for what felt like hours, though the sky had barely lightened further by the time the tide of battle began perceptibly to shift. Defenders who had been on the verge of routing found new courage at the sight of the breach suddenly, impossibly held. Word spread along the ramparts faster than any messenger could carry it. A stranger fighting like something out of legend, alone, unstoppable, buying time the garrison had believed moments before they no longer possessed. It was Aragorn who found him in the breach's aftermath, once the immediate crisis had passed and the Uruk-hai forces had, for the moment, pulled back to regroup for a second assault. The ranger's face carried an expression of stunned, exhausted relief that Kratos had not seen on him before, not even in their first meeting's careful wariness. "You came," Aragorn said, and there was something almost disbelieving in the words, as though he had allowed himself the hope but not the expectation. "I told you our roads had not finished crossing," Kratos said, breathing hard blood, not his own, soaking his forearms past the wrist. This seemed as good a place as any for them to cross again. Aragorn's mouth twisted into something that was almost a laugh, exhausted and grim and grateful all at once. "The second assault will come within the hour, and it will be worse than the first. Theoden's forces cannot hold the wall much longer, even with your arrival." "Then we had better make sure they don't need to hold it much longer," Kratos said, and turned back toward the breach, the Leviathan axe steady in his grip as the first gray light of true dawn began finally to break over the mountains to the east, and the horns of Saruman's second assault sounded, distant but drawing closer, across the plain beyond the deep's battered walls. The second assault came exactly as Aragorn predicted, worse than the first, driven by Uruk-hai commanders who had clearly received new orders to break the wall by whatever cost necessary. Now that word of a single, unstoppable defender had reached whatever chain of command still answered to Saruman's distant will. Kratos held the breach through that assault too, and the one that followed it, until the boundary between one wave of attackers and the next blurred into a single, unbroken span of violence that stretched from the last hour of night into the first full light of morning. It was in the depth of that third assault, as exhaustion finally began to catch up with even his considerable endurance, that Kratos felt something shift in himself that Treebeard's warning had tried days before to prepare him for. The rage that had consumed him in Fangorn's ruined sapling grove began again to rise, not gradually this time, but with the sudden, overwhelming totality of a dam giving way, fed by exhaustion and the accumulated weight of every death he had dealt and witnessed since the first assault began. He felt himself begin to lose the careful, deliberate control that had defined his fighting until this point, the axe's strikes growing wilder, less precise, driven by something closer to blind fury than tactical necessity. He killed an Uruk-hai who had already turned to flee, cutting the creature down from behind in a way that offered no honor and served no strategic purpose, and the wrongness of that action, the echo of every excessive kill he had dealt across two dead pantheons, finally broke through the rising red haze enough for him to recognize what was happening to him in real time. He stopped. In the middle of a battlefield still very much contested, with Uruk-hai forces still pressing the breach on either side of him, Kratos forced himself to simply stop, breathing hard, the Leviathan axe trembling faintly in a grip that had, for one terrible moment, belonged more to the rage than to him. Treebeard's words returned to him with sudden, unwelcome clarity. "A fire that burns without limit does not distinguish between the wood that threatens the forest and the wood that does not." He thought, in that suspended, dangerous moment, of Frodo's small, steady courage. Of Aragorn's careful, earned trust. Of a village headman who had thanked him for arriving before all his people died, rather than condemning him for arriving after some of them already had. He thought finally of his son, of Atreus, small and frightened and looking up at him across a burning world, needing a father who could master his own fire rather than be consumed by it. The rage did not vanish. It never fully did, not in two collapsed pantheons, not here. But he found, in that suspended moment atop the deeping wall's breach, a measure of control he had not always managed to find before, not the absence of fury, but the choice to wield it rather than be wielded by it. He raised the axe again and returned to the fight, but the wildness had gone out of his strikes, replaced by the same controlled, purposeful violence that had carried him through the fight's opening hours. The assault broke, eventually, against a defense that would not yield, and as the sun rose fully over the gorge, casting long golden light across a battlefield littered with the dead of both sides, word came from the fortress's higher ramparts that a relief force had arrived. Gandalf, returned with reinforcements Kratos had not known to expect, riding down from the eastern hills to catch the remaining Uruk-hai forces in a pincer that broke what remained of their organized assault entirely. The battle ended not long after, the surviving attackers fleeing into the forest that had, unbeknownst to them, become considerably less safe in recent days thanks to an Entmoot's grim and final decision. Kratos found a quiet corner of the fortress's shattered outer ward once the fighting had fully ceased, sitting alone amid the wreckage while the garrison's survivors began the grim work of tending wounded and counting dead, and it was there that Aragorn found him some hours later, the ranger's face carrying the particular hollow exhaustion of a commander who had spent everything he had to spend and was only now beginning to reckon with the cost. You saved this fortress, Aragorn said, settling beside him without ceremony. Theoden's people will remember what you did here for generations, I think, whatever name they eventually give the stranger who held the breach. I nearly lost myself in the doing of it, Kratos said, more honestly than he had intended, the words drawn out of him by an exhaustion too complete to maintain his usual careful reserve. There is a rage in me that does not distinguish, once it takes hold, between the killing that saves and the killing that simply feeds itself. I have crossed that line before in wars I fought for reasons I believed were good. I nearly crossed it again today in the middle of saving people I had never met, for a cause I told myself for weeks was not mine to fight. Aragorn considered this for a long moment, watching the wounded being carried past them toward whatever healing the fortress's overtaxed resources could provide. Every warrior I have known carries something like that, the ranger said finally. A fire that serves them until the day it doesn't. I do not think the answer is to extinguish it entirely. I suspect a man like you who has faced what you've faced would not survive the extinguishing. But I have watched you, these past hours, choose to master it rather than simply unleash it. That is not nothing, stranger. That may, in fact, be the entire difference between the hero this fortress will remember you as, and the monster Saruman's propaganda would prefer to paint you. Kratos turned this over, weighing it against the accumulated weight of every battlefield he had walked away from with blood on his hands that extended beyond simple necessity. Why do I keep doing this? He said, and it was not quite a question, more a confession offered to the exhausted morning air. I told myself weeks ago that this was not my war. I told your council the same. And yet here I am, having bled for a fortress full of strangers, having nearly lost myself doing it, and I find I do not regret the choice, even knowing what it nearly cost me. Perhaps, Aragorn said quietly, because some part of you understands better than the rest of you is willing to admit, that a man who has lost as much as you have does not find peace by refusing every war he encounters. Perhaps he finds it instead by choosing which wars are worth the cost, and discovering each time that the cost is worth paying when the cause is one he can look at honestly and call good. The ranger rose, offering Kratos a hand to help him to his feet, an ordinary courtesy that carried in the moment more weight than either man fully acknowledged. I do not know what gods you owed allegiance to, in whatever world shaped you before this one. But I think, watching you these past weeks, that whatever debt you believe you owe to grief and rage and the dead you could not save, you have been quietly repaying it, one battle at a time, since the night we first met in that forest clearing. Kratos accepted the hand, rising to stand amid the wreckage of a battle he had chosen finally and fully to fight, not because a council had asked it of him, not because a wizard had bargained for it, but because some quieter, more honest part of him had recognized, somewhere in the accumulated weight of villages burned and forests violated and a fortress nearly overrun, that a war worth fighting had finally found him, and that running from it any longer would have cost him more than simply staying and bleeding for it ever could. There is still a war beyond this fortress, Kratos said, looking east toward mountains that hid, somewhere beyond them, a black tower and a burning eye that had been watching him. He now understood, since the night a Nazgul first found him on a lonely ridge. I do not think Isengard's fall, or even this siege's end, is the last debt this world will ask me to pay. No, Aragorn agreed, following his gaze toward the same distant mountains. I do not think it is. But we will meet whatever comes next together, stranger, if you are willing, not as a weapon claimed by a council's convenience, but as an ally who has chosen this fight for reasons that are, finally, entirely his own. The weeks that followed Helm's Deep carried Kratos further into Middle-earth's war than he had ever intended when he first stepped through Rivendell's gates as a self-declared neutral observer. He fought at Isengard's final fall, arriving in time to see Treebeard's flood-drowned ruin of Saruman's industry complete itself with a grim, ancient satisfaction that required no further violence from Kratos to finish. He stood witness, from a discreet distance, as Saruman himself was stripped of his staff and his power by Gandalf's own hand. A reckoning Kratos had no part in delivering, though he found himself, watching it, feeling something close to closure regarding the wizard whose bargain and betrayal had first taught him exactly how thoroughly he had already been drawn into this world's war. But it was the news that reached him weeks later, carried by riders moving fast along roads still recovering from the war's devastation, that finally brought the full weight of his choices into focus. The ring was gone, destroyed in the fires of Orodruin by a hobbit's small, unbreakable courage, aided in the final desperate moment by circumstances Kratos would only later understand in full. Sauron's power had broken with it, the Black Tower's eye extinguished, the armies that had marched under its command scattered or destroyed in the war's final, decisive battles before the Black Gate itself. He had not been present for that ending. He had spent the war's final weeks instead in Rohan and the borderlands, helping rebuild what Saruman's ambitions and Sauron's armies had destroyed, choosing, deliberately this time rather than by reluctant accident, to spend his strength on the quieter work of a war's aftermath rather than its climactic battles. It was, he reflected often in the aftermath, a kind of penance he had not fully articulated even to himself. For every village he had arrived at too late, for every excess his rage had committed, for every debt he still felt he owed to a world that had never asked for his particular brand of violence but had received it regardless. Aragorn found him again months later in a Gondor rebuilding itself under a newly crowned king. The same ranger Kratos had first met defending a stranger against 8 orcs in a forgotten forest clearing, now Elisar, king of the reunited kingdom, carrying his authority with the same quiet, careful weight he had always carried his sword. "You could stay," the king said as they stood together on the White City's highest terrace, looking out over a realm slowly healing from a war whose scars would take generations to fully close. "Gondor would welcome you, not as a weapon as you once feared, but as what you have proven yourself to be. A protector who chose this fight and chose it well." Kratos considered the offer for a long moment, weighing it against everything he had learned about himself in the months since a rift had thrown him into this world. The rage he had nearly lost himself to, the control he had painstakingly learned to reclaim, the strange, unexpected purpose he had found in a war that had never truly belonged to him and yet had, somehow, become his own by the sheer accumulated weight of choices made one battle at a time. "I do not know if I will find my way home," Kratos said finally. "I have searched in the quiet hours between battles for any sign of the rift that brought me here and found nothing. Perhaps I never will. But I do not think I am meant to spend whatever years remain to me guarding a single city's walls, however worthy that city has proven itself to be." He looked out over Gondor's rebuilding spires, thinking of forests still healing from Saruman's violation, of borderland villages still recovering from raids sent as messages he had refused to heed quickly enough, of a whole wounded world that extended far beyond any single kingdom's borders. "There is more of this world I have not yet seen. More debts, I suspect, that will find me whether I go looking for them or not. I think I am meant to walk it, Aragorn, Elisar, for as long as this world has need of what I can offer it, and however long that proves to be." The king studied him with the same careful, measuring respect he had offered since their first meeting in a dark forest, and finally nodded, understanding better than most, exactly what it meant to choose a harder, less certain path over an easier, more settled one. "Then go with whatever blessing a king's gratitude is worth," Elisar said. "And know that whatever roads you walk, Gondor's gates will remain open to you, should you ever have need of walls to rest behind." Kratos left the White City 3 days later, walking east and south into borderlands still scarred by war, toward a horizon that held, he suspected, more battles and more grief and more hard-won moments of the same fragile self-mastery he had fought so hard to reclaim atop Helm's Deep's battered walls. He did not know, walking those roads, whether he would ever find his way home, to Midgard, to whatever remained of the world he had left behind. He did not know whether Middle-earth's peace would hold, or whether new threats, born from the same patterns of ambition and grief that had doomed 2 pantheons before this world's war, would eventually rise to test the fragile stability this generation's sacrifice had purchased. But he walked anyway, the Leviathan axe steady across his back, the blades of chaos quiet at his hips, carrying forward not the reckless, unmastered fire that had once defined his worst mistakes, but something closer to the hard-won balance, a hobbit's quiet courage, a ranger's patient trust, and an ancient forest's ageless wisdom had each, in their own way, helped him rediscover. He had come to this world a stranger who wanted nothing but solitude and answers. He left its central war a protector who had chosen, deliberately and with clear eyes, exactly what kind of power he intended to be for as long as this strange, beautiful, wounded world had need of him. Somewhere behind him, Middle-earth's peoples would tell stories for generations, of the godless stranger who held a breach that should have broken, who walked beside kings and wizards and ancient trees without ever fully belonging to any of their causes, and who taught a world built on ancient magics and older grudges that sometimes the fiercest mercy comes from a warrior who has already lost everything and chooses, anyway, not to let that loss define the only thing he still has left to give. The war's ending did not arrive as a single moment of triumph so much as a long, uneven unclenching, the slow, cautious exhale of a world that had spent generations bracing for a darkness it feared might never lift. Kratos walked through the first true peace Middle-earth had known in an age, and found that peace, like every other unfamiliar country he had crossed since falling through the rift, required its own kind of learning. He had not been present at the Black Gate when Sauron's power finally broke. He had not stood among the small celebrated company that watched a hobbit's courage undo an age of tyranny in the fires of Orodruin. That absence, he came to understand, was fitting rather than diminishing. His war had never been the same war as Frodo's, however their roads had crossed and tangled across the months between Bree and Isengard's fall. His war had been quieter, fought village by village, breach by breach, and most fiercely of all, within the narrower and more dangerous battlefield of his own unmastered rage. That he had won it, imperfectly at real cost but won it nonetheless, mattered to him more than any victory parade could have. What lingered longest in the weeks and months that followed, was not the memory of Uruk-hai armies breaking against a held wall, nor even the strange ancient companionship of a forest older than grief itself. It was the small things. Frodo's steady, frightened courage at their first meeting, offered without any of the desperate bravado Kratos had grown accustomed to in mortals facing forces beyond their understanding. Aragorn's patient, incremental trust, extended not because Kratos demanded it but because he had time and again chosen restraint when restraint cost him something real. Treebeard's unhurried wisdom, delivered in the geological cadence of a being who had watched empires rise and fall and understood, better than any god Kratos had ever killed, that power without self-mastery was simply violence waiting for an excuse. These were not the lessons Kratos had expected to carry out of a rift that had torn him from one broken world and deposited him, without ceremony or warning, into another. He had arrived in Middle-earth already convinced he understood the shape of his own darkness, had spent 2 collapsed pantheons cataloging every excess, every death that crossed the line from necessity into indulgence, every moment the rage had taken more from him than the fight required. He had not expected a world so different from his own, governed by a magic he still did not fully understand, populated by small, unassuming creatures whose courage exceeded that of the gods he had spent his life fighting, to teach him anything new about a wound he thought he had already mapped completely. But Fangorn's burned sapling grove had taught him something Olympus and Asgard never had, that the line between necessary violence and indulgent excess was not a fixed boundary he had already learned to walk, but a discipline that required constant, deliberate renewal, a choice made fresh in every battle, not a lesson learned once and carried forever after. Helm's Deep had taught him that mastering that discipline in the moment it mattered most was possible, even for a man who had failed that same test more times than he cared to count across 2 dead worlds. And the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding villages and borderland farms in the war's aftermath had taught him, perhaps most importantly, that the debt he felt he owed this world, and by extension, the debt he still felt toward every grave he had left behind in Sparta, in Greece, in the frozen north, was not a debt that could be repaid through a single act of heroism. It could only be repaid the way Aragorn had suggested, on that exhausted morning after the siege. One battle, one choice, one act of chosen restraint at a time. He did not find his way home. Whatever tear in the world's fabric had thrown him into Middle-earth remained, as far as his searching ever discovered, closed and unfindable, a door with no visible handle on this side of it. Perhaps it would open again someday, delivering him back to a Midgard he had left mid-journey, or perhaps it would not, and this strange, wounded, healing world would become the only home he had left to claim. He did not know, and in the months following the war's end, he found himself surprised by how little that uncertainty troubled him. He had spent so much of his existence chasing a peace that always proved temporary, a rest that always ended in new grief. Middle-earth had offered him something different, not peace exactly, not yet, but purpose freely chosen, unburdened by prophecy or obligation, shaped entirely by his own hard-won judgment of what was worth fighting for and how fiercely that fight deserved to be waged. He walked east from Gundor's gates with no fixed destination, only the accumulated certainty that this world, healing and fragile and full of small, unexpected courage, still had need of whatever he could offer it, and that he, for the first time in either of his collapsed lives, was finally choosing to give that offering freely, rather than having it torn from him by grief, by rage, or by gods who valued him only for the violence he could commit on their behalf. Behind him, the white city spires caught the morning light, and ahead of him, a world scarred by war but no longer ruled by its shadow stretched toward a horizon he had not yet learned to read. He walked toward it anyway, carrying 2 dead pantheons worth of hard-earned wisdom into a single, quieter, more deliberate future, one battle and one choice at a time.